Welcome everyone to day 2 of AAC 2023. As with yesterday, I'm going to leave it a minute or so for more people to come in and just double check on my phone that the stream is coming through nicely. Leave it a minute or so for more people to come in. Yeah, looks like we are indeed live and we have nearly 30 people. So I'm going to crack on with the opening address. Now, just to warn you all, this will be a very similar welcome address to the one that you heard yesterday. So if you did hear this one yesterday, you do have my permission to go and grab a coffee for 5 minutes and then be back for the first talk. But for those who weren't here, I'm going to present our welcome address. So welcome everyone to the Antinatalist Advocacy Conference 2023, Antinatalism at a Crossroads. I'm John Williams, one of the co-founders of Antinatalist Advocacy with my good friend and fellow co-founder Lawrence Anton, and he'll be hosting today's first session shortly. We're hosting the conference over these 2 days, and we're very grateful that you've all decided to join us for it. As a heads up, as I mentioned, this will be very similar to yesterday's opening address, so please do come back in 5 if you'd like to avoid a repeat. But as I did yesterday, we will begin by introducing AA or Antinatalist Advocacy as an organisation. So in short, we seek to help protect sentient beings from the harms of coming into existence, and we advocate refraining from creating new sentient beings, as well as improving the lives of those who exist now and will exist in the future. More specifically, we have 3 overarching aims that drive our actions. 1, to encourage the antinatalist community to adopt an evidence-based, impact-driven approach to activism and help grow the community's capacity to do good. 2, to redress what we see as an antinatalist blind spot in communities that seek to have a positive impact on the world. And lastly, to research and develop the contribution that antinatalism can make in efforts to do good. We hope that the discussions presented this weekend, both yesterday and today, at our very first AA conference can help to contribute to these aims. So let's move on to the matters at hand and recent developments in antinatalism. So according to the Wikipedia definition, antinatalism is a family of philosophical views that are critical of reproduction. They consider coming into existence as bad or deem procreation as immoral. According to the Oxford Dictionary, a crossroads is a point at which a crucial decision must be made, which will have far-reaching consequences. So why do we at AA feel that this family of philosophical views and the communities that subscribe to them are at a point where crucial decisions must be made? Whilst there are still definitional questions surrounding what antinatalism is, the central and widely accepted idea it posits is that coming into existence is a harm. From this, many questions spring up. Is antinatalism simply about humans not having children, or does it include other sentient beings? Does antinatalism have implications for only our reproductive choices, or are there other actions that we are obligated to take or not take under antinatalism? Should antinatalists pursue voluntary human extinction, or is this misguided? While we at Antinatalist Advocacy do not claim to have indisputable answers to all of these pressing questions, we are, both during and after this conference, hoping to nurture conversations that will provide valuable insight into how these key questions could be answered. This inaugural Antinatalist Advocacy Conference comes against a backdrop of growing mainstream awareness of antinatalism. More antinatalists are engaging in advocacy, both in person and online, to try and bring their message to a broader audience. Groups like Stop Having Kids and the Voluntary Human Extinction Movement, or Vehement, have gained mainstream media coverage, including some warnings on Twitter, now X, from Elon Musk. And as well as these events, there have been significant developments in each of the cause areas identified by antinatalist advocacy: human procreation, animal agriculture, wild animal suffering, and artificial sentience, that highlight the urgency of coming to something of a general consensus on the foundational questions of antinatalism so that we can go on to have a positive impact on the world. So what are these significant developments? Well, last year, the human population surpassed 8 billion for the first time. Despite the growing social recognition of veganism and animal rights activism, the number of farmed animals being brought into existence and slaughtered annually has increased as the human race on the whole becomes more affluent. Growing concern about the environment has shone a light on the impact of our actions on the extraordinary large numbers of animals in the wild, which we'll hear more about shortly. And what's more, recent advances in artificial intelligence have raised the prospect of humans intentionally or unintentionally creating artificial sentience. We believe that antinatalists could have an important role to play in all of these issues. This isn't to say that the target of this conference is solely those who identify with the antinatalist label. People of all viewpoints can be motivated to protect beings from the harms that sentient existence puts us at risk of, and we believe that we should be open to engaging with those who share these motivations. Therefore, we would advocate for the building of bridges between our small but growing community and other communities where we align on specific issues, rather than seeking to exclude others who may not agree with the entirety of our antinatalist message. In the spirit of this agreement and charity, we would like to extend our gratitude to those who have made this conference possible. First off, the speakers who've graciously given up their free time to participate. We'd also like to thank the moderators who are helping us make sure that the conference runs as smoothly as possible. And a huge thank you to the donor who kindly agreed to support the costs of running this conference. Well, I said yesterday that I would like to thank Lawrence, who's done a grand job with the organising, but after yesterday's technical slip-ups, I'm not so sure about that. But on a serious note, Lawrence has done the vast majority of organising, and I think so far he's done a very good job. So we'll have a quick rundown of our speakers. So in our first session yesterday, we were joined by philosopher David Pearce to make the case for genome reform and a biohappiness revolution. Next, we heard from activist Seb Alex about why antinatalists should consider the importance of animal rights. We then concluded yesterday's conference with a talk from philosopher Matti Hairi about antinatalism and extinction. Today's sessions will begin with a talk from philosopher Oscar Horta about contraception and population ethics in welfare biology. We'll then be hosting antinatalist advocates Amanda Sukanik and Ash Wickety and child-free advocate Shweta Ramkumar for a panel on building a healthy antinatalist community. And we'll then conclude our conference with an in-conversation session with author Magnus Finding on suffering-focused ethics and how antinatalists can have a positive impact on the world. Before we get to today's first talk, we do have a few points of housekeeping to cover. We will ask everyone to maintain a civil dialogue in the live chat of this conference, as there will be topics that viewers disagree on, and we will be moderating the chat where this cannot be maintained. We had a great atmosphere in the chat yesterday, so please do keep that up. If you do have any questions for the speakers, please submit them via the form that is pinned in the live chat. Questions posted directly in the live chat will not be included. Please feel free to share the conference. You can click the share button below the stream, and feel free to tag us on X or Instagram if you do so. As with yesterday, there will be an official hangout after the end of the conference, which will be hosted on Discord. The link to join us is in the description of the live stream. If you would like to make a donation to support the ongoing efforts of antinatalist advocacy, please send us an email at contact@antinatalistadvocacy.org. These would be very much appreciated. All sessions will be uploaded onto our YouTube channel after the fact, so you can watch everything on catch up. And lastly, as I've mentioned, this is our very first conference at Antinatalist Advocacy, so there will undoubtedly be room for improvement. We would therefore be very grateful if you could share our thoughts on this weekend by completing our feedback form that will be linked in our newsletter following the end of this conference. That's all the housekeeping out of the way. Just wanted to thank you again for tuning in to the Antinatalist Advocacy Conference 2023, and the first session with Oscar will commence shortly.
Okay, so welcome to this, the first session of day 2 for the Antinatalist Advocacy Conference 2023. So I am joined for session 4 out of the 6 total sessions by Oscar Horta. So I'm sure he needs no introduction. I'm sure you all know who he is, but I'm going to give a brief one anyway, and then we will get into the role of things. So Oscar's going to be talking about wild animal contraception. Oscar is a moral philosopher in the Department of Philosophy and Anthropology at the University of Santiago de Compostela. I hope I said that correctly. He's written many papers and books on the topic of animal ethics, including his 2022 book, Making a Stand for Animals. In 2023, he published a paper but I think that is it. So we can get into things from here. I think Oscar, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can't. I can. I couldn't hear you for some time, but now I can. Yeah.
Okay, cool. I think I was just having a bit of internet issues. Okay, cool. It looks to be it looks to be back now. Cool. Right. So, Oscar, I'll hand over to you to do your thing.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thanks a lot. So I'm gonna speak here about wild animal contraception, but I'll just tackle some of the, as you can see in the slide, the ethical considerations involved. So I'm not gonna address the technical issues surrounding this. I'll say just a word about those. And also in presenting this field of wild animal contraception, I'm going to be addressing other issues having to do with how the lives of animals in the wild are and, well, what reasons we have to help them. So, also, sorry, because some of the slides are not going to be like nice ones, but well, that's how our reality is. But yeah, I hope they are nevertheless not too awful to watch. Anyway, so the vast majority of the animals that exist are not out there suffering in slaughterhouses and in factory farms or in fish factories. I'm saying this is saying a great deal already, because there are a lot, really a lot of animals in those places, right? We may be speaking of maybe a number of vertebrates killed often in terrible ways by humans, that maybe like around, say, 2 billion, but then, or 2 trillion, sorry. But then the number of invertebrates that are killed by humans is even higher, maybe 25 trillion, according to some estimates. But when we speak about wild animals, we are talking about maybe potentially a number of 10 to the power of 18, 19, 20. It's like orders of magnitude higher, a way higher number of animals. And their lives, unfortunately, are not that great. They suffer and die prematurely due to a number of reasons, including, for instance, lack of food or water, hostile weather conditions, also disease, parasitism, things like accidents, all kind of deaths, terrible ones. And often, in many cases, it's not just that these animals have these awful deaths. It's also that they don't have really great lives in addition to the experience of the death. So we can see this in the case of and again, I'm sorry if this picture is not a nice one to see, but if we consider the fate of an animal like a chick, a small bird that falls from the nest and may agonize to death, suffering from the pain of the injuries, maybe starving to death, maybe being eaten by other animals. So this is not something that happens to a minority of animals, right? There are ways in which we can have if rough, a general idea of what may be the levels of well-being that animals have out there by looking at things like, for instance, their population dynamics or their age-specific mortality or their reproductive strategies. Now, why is this so? Well, because by looking at these things, we can find that, there are all kind of different animals with respect to how their numbers vary through time, and also with respect to how old or young they are when they die, or when the majority of them die. And also, well, we can also look at the way in which they reproduce. That is, how many offspring they have. And if we look at that, we can see some things that are highly relevant for, the kind of evaluation that we can do of how good or bad the lives of these animals are. So what happens is that the vast majority of animals reproduce by having huge numbers of offspring. I mean, if we consider, for instance, some amphibians, they may lay thousands of eggs. If we consider some fish species, they may lay millions of eggs, sometimes hundreds of millions of them. And the fact is that on average, these animals don't survive to maturity, because otherwise their population would explode. They would grow dramatically in a very short time. What happens, however, is that the vast majority of them die often shortly after coming into existence. And if, for instance, you look at a pond where a frog may have lay her eggs, you come there first and you can see a lot of eggs there. Then you come back a few days later and you'll find that the eggs are no longer there. What you'll find are tadpoles, but the number of tadpoles that are around is, of course, smaller than the number of eggs. And then you come back some days later and you'll find that the tadpoles are bigger, but their numbers have significantly dwindled because many of them die in the process. And this is not something that happens in the case of a minority of animals. This happens to many animals. I mean, the majority of the animals reproduce in this way, right? By having many offspring. So the fact is that we typically don't think of that. So when we look, for instance, at a picture like this one, what we find is, oh, these cute animals, these nice chicks, these nice ducklings here. And we don't consider that on average, only one of them per parent will make it to maturity, right? And as we said, and as I said before, as we saw, their deaths can be very painful, right? So when animals die and they are very young, what happens is that they don't live long enough for them to have positive experiences, but they have the negative experience of dying, starving to death, being eaten alive, and so on, right? Okay, so in light of this, maybe we can make some guesses about what the well-being distributions in populations may be. Consider, for instance, this table where the horizontal axis represents time and the vertical one, the numbers of animals. That is, for a certain population of animals, how many animals are present there at a given time. So with some animals, it works like this. So what happens is that they have low juvenile mortality. Many of them survive until they reach a very old age. This is what happens, for instance, in the case of human beings. But cases like this are a minority. These are called type 1 when it comes to designing the different survivorship curves among different animals. Now, type 2 would be a mixture of type 1 and type 3, but what we are especially concerned with here is type 3, and type 3 is this, has these animals classified in type 3, they have very high numbers of animals that die when they're very young. They have very high juvenile mortality. So this is interesting because this fits what we've seen before. The fact that many animals reproduce by having many offspring who die when they are very young. So suppose we made some estimates of what the well-being of animals in these populations may be. Well, there's going to be inequality for sure. I mean, not all animals have the same levels of well-being. Not all lives are equally good or bad. But these graphs kind of give us they give us a hint of the levels of well-being that there can be in those populations. Because if you die very old, you may expect to have a good life. I mean, not always, but you may. I mean, not always, because you may have some, I don't know, chronic disease or something. Whereas if you die when you are very young, your life is going to be pretty bad. So imagine that we try to, draw some, some graphic where we represent how good or bad the lives of animals can be. So if we are optimistic concerning how the lives of the animals of type 1 may be, we may think that, well, the level of well-being may be like the one you see in the left, right? Where the horizontal line represents the 0 level at which life starts being net positive or net negative. If we are less optimistic, that means that many animals will have net negative levels. But as you'll recall, only a minority of the animals can fit within type 1. The majority of them will fall within type 3. And here, if we have an optimistic assessment, we may be relatively uncertain about how many animals have positive levels of well-being and how many of them have net negative ones. But if we are less optimistic, then it may well be the case that the vast majority of them have very bad lives. So this shows that for many animals, coming into existence is no blessing. It's something pretty bad. It also indicates that the lives of animals may vary significantly. So there are animals of certain populations, of certain species, who have much worse lives than others, right? Okay, so once we've seen that, the next point to consider here is the fact that human beings, while often indifferent to what happens to non-human animals, in some cases they react and they do things that can help animals, right? So there are many different ways in which human beings are helping animals out there in the wild. I mean, wild animals really shouldn't be only considered, I mean, we shouldn't only consider as wild those animals that are maybe out there in, I don't know, national parks or, in the forest or so. There are also wild animals in agricultural areas or urban or suburban areas. And many of these animals, when they are injured, when they are, for instance, sick or when they are orphaned, they may get helped. There are also other initiatives such as rescues of animals when they're affected by extreme weather events or natural disasters. And there may be also, there actually are other initiatives that help very large numbers of animals. So this picture you see here, well, as you can see, it's a small plane, and you see they are manipulating something there. So, well, the things that they are manipulating, they are doses of, they are baits that have doses of a vaccine, in this case, against rabies. And they are throwing them from the air because they want to prevent the spread of this disease among certain animals. The reason why they do this is because they don't want these animals to pass this disease to human beings. However, by doing this, they are helping very significantly the animals that are vaccinated, right? And this is not something new. This has been done for decades already. Since the 80s, you can find scientific papers in journals, addressing this that are more than 40 years old. And these programs, as I say, they have been implemented first with pilot programs, then they have been monitored, and after this monitorization, they have been expanded to other places, and they have not been done only in the case of diseases like rabies. They have also been applied in the case of diseases such as tuberculosis, anthrax, swine fever, and several others. So there is a lot of experience about this already, meaning that we could do more to help these animals. Okay, however, of course, you can think of an objection, right? Which is, what if by helping animals, we do more harm than good? And the best example of this that we can think of is what happens when we feed animals. So in this picture, you can see some manatees that are being fed some lettuces. So what happens when we provide food to animals, but also when we help them in other ways, it's just that feeding them would be the clearest example, is that we can make their numbers grow. So for instance, suppose that there is a population of animals that is starving, and this is bad and we can help them. But if we do this, then we run the risk of, multiplying the population of these animals and make it the case that in the future, they'll suffer a lot. Is there something we can do about this? Well, the fact is that there is something we can do about this, which is combining the program where we are helping animals with contraception. Now, contraception programs have been run already in many different places all around the world. As you can see here in these pictures, this is something that appears in the news every now and then. A clear example of this is what happens in the case of birds who live in towns or cities. And at some point, people decide that, well, they are too numerous, we want to get rid of them, and they want to kill them. So an alternative to that, which means that they won't be harmed in this way, is by using contraception. The same thing happens, for instance, with deer, or shall we say deers, because they are not an uncountable mass, even if this is not a standard English, that are also threatened by hunters because people think that their numbers are too high. So contraception is a sound alternative to this. And there are many different examples of this. You can see this one, the ones I presented come from different countries. You can see this one in the case of other animals in the UK. And you can see in the right that the announcement of a conference on fertility controls for wild animals, like boars, right? It's a conference that took place in a university in Barcelona. And there are other examples of this. So in some cases, contraception is kind of difficult because you need to inject a vaccine, including the contraceptive, to animals. This happens, for instance, in the case of contraception used with large ungulates. But for instance, in the case of other animals, you can administrate orally the contraceptive. You can create some, food products that will contain the vaccine, as you can see here in this picture. So, as we've seen, then this is something that is widely available. This is something that has been done, and this is something that is backed by science and even by governments. So, for instance, these two screenshots here come from the British government, right? And from a British governmental agency, and they address two different ways in which animals could be administered contraception. There are different ways in which this can happen. So, for instance, with large herbivores, typically they are now using a product called Gonacon. In the past, they have been using also PCP. So these products basically prevent the animals from reproducing, but they need to be administered, these products, every now and then. So it's not like, neutering, right? In some cases, neutering could be used, but it's more costly and so on. But there are other alternatives, at least with some animals, that are relatively cheap, as I mentioned before, just with feeding them with something that contains the contraception. So why is this important? It's important first because it can prevent humans from killing animals. Second, because it can also help us to help the animals, as I mentioned before. We can help the animals with while at the same time we prevent the bad effects that could have. And then on top of that, we can also have an impact in, and this may be the most controversial effect that it has, which is that it can make it the case that the animals that are present in certain ecosystems are those that typically have better lives instead of worse lives, which, as we saw, it's actually the case. Not all animals have the same levels of well-being, and as we also saw, many of them are actually not blessed by coming into existence, but it's just the other way around for them. They suffer very significantly in the process. We do have the support here often of a significant part of the public, also by governmental agencies, and it's something that is growing. In this website here, you can Google it, you can see how many cases of interventions like this are taking place around. So that list there that you see is not exhaustive, it's just a screenshot. The list is much longer, and this is something that is continuing to be the object of scientific research. So, for instance, this is a screenshot of a scientific paper that was published just this year, addressing this from a wide perspective, considering different approaches to this. And in this slide here, you can also see a picture from a recent report that was published at the Animal Ethics website. Animal Ethics is the organization I work with. In this case, it reviews methods of contraception for wild animals. So all this means that this is a promising way of, helping animals, that much more attention should be paid to it that is paid right now. And also, I want to mention that there may be other things involved, other issues involved here that many people in the public, from the general public, may be ignorant about, but show other ways in which we can prevent animals from coming into existence that have been actually quite successful in attaining things that don't have to do necessarily with the well-being of animals, but that as a side effect are very positive for the animals themselves. So one example of this, the one that I want to highlight here, is this one that you can see in this slide, the sterile insect technique. Now, what this consists in is what follows. So certain numbers of male insects, mostly mosquitoes, they are bred in captivity and they're sterilizing in captivity. So what happens is that these male mosquitoes, they are then released, and they have sex with the female mosquitoes, but the eggs that the female mosquitoes lay are not viable ones. So in this way, these populations of animals are reduced. Why is this used? Well, because these mosquitoes may be transmitting very bad diseases like malaria that harm humans or may harm other animals. Is it bad? Is this bad for the animals? Well, not coming into existence. If you are a member of a species like those of many insects, which typically may have lives that are not good, well, it shouldn't be considered something bad. It should be considered something good. So what we are finding here is that we are doing something for the sake of human well-being, but then we are reducing huge amounts of suffering for these animals, and then for other animals, of course, that these animals may affect as well, because they not just pass on diseases to human beings, they also pass them to other animals. And then there are other ways in which, while not being at stake something like what we've seen before, the general idea is kind of related. And this has to do with reforestation plans. So what happens is that when we reforest a certain area, we can make some studies on the ecology there, on what will be the successions of the ecosystems that we expect there to be. And as a result, we can sort of guess that if we plant certain trees, for instance, a certain vegetation, some animals will be there. If we don't do it, then other animals will be there. On the basis of this, we can consider, okay, it's maybe better if the animals that have typically better lives, those who reproduce by having fewer numbers of offspring, are present there. Among the things, they will eat the biomass that otherwise will be eaten by animals who typically have bad lives. So that would be good, because by making it the case that some animals are present there, we are going to reduce overall significantly the number of animals that are there. And this is also especially because the animals who typically reproduce by having few offspring tend to be animals, I mean, this is not always the case, but often their size is much larger than the size of small animals who reproduce by laying many eggs, okay? So this, while not being about contraception itself, shows how an idea similar to the one informing contraception efforts from an ethical viewpoint can have other implications as well. And finally, I'm gonna be finishing soon. I want to mention that it's very important that we start discussing this and that we start to be concerned about this, not just because of what is happening to animals right now, but also because of what may happen to animals in the future. So you may think that this slide here is about something that looks kind of sci-fi-ish, looks like science fiction, yeah, but it's actually true. And this is about something that happened a few years ago. An Israeli ship tried to land on the moon, and well, it didn't succeed, but it was carrying a certain number of invertebrates, in this case, tardigrades. So there is an increasing number of experiments outside Earth bringing animals there. Moreover, what about panspermia? Panspermia is the, it's the name that is given to efforts to spread life outside Earth. And this life may be, filled with suffering. This was examined by Gary O'Brien in this paper that was published a few years ago. So this shows why it's important to start talking about this. Wild animal contraception, or animal contraception in general, is important because of its implication right now. But if we get society and if we get the relevant key agents to care about this, so people get familiar with this idea and they start supporting it more and more, this can not only prevent many hours, days, years of suffering right now or in the near future, it may also be extremely influential in order to prevent very bad things happening to non-human beings in the long term, in the far future. So I think it's very important then that we take this seriously as this issue deserves. And that would be it with regards to my presentation. Thanks for listening to this, and I'll be very happy to take any questions that you have about this.
Classic was on mute. Thank you so much for that, Oscar. And we'll have some questions from the audience, but I've got a few to begin with. And actually, this wasn't on my list, but the first thing I wanted to actually ask you about was the last thing you talked about panspermia. And, you know, we're now getting to the point in, humanity's level of technological development where we, you know, it is actually getting to a significant risk, I would say, to frame it negatively, that we may unintentionally or intentionally spread wild animals to other planets, you know, in some time in the future. How much of a risk do you perceive that as? And are you, I don't know how plugged in you are into the, you know, the people who are sort of working on this sort of stuff, but are you aware of any voices in the groups that are trying to take humans off of Earth that are actually pushing back against this to try, you know, because they're aware of these risks?
Yeah, well, thanks for that question. That's a very important one, I think. So unfortunately, I'm not aware of any, discussion about this. I mean, at least among the people who are willing to do these kind of things, considering the interests of non-human beings. So those who are considering the interests of non-human animals are people who, you know, are involved in animal advocacy, wild animal advocacy, or doing academic work concerning animals, but they are not the ones really dealing with the scientific discussions about this. So that's bad. And yes, there are many different ways in which this could happen. I mean, I just mentioned directed panspermia, or, you know, I also mentioned experiments carried out outside Earth. But, you know, whenever we are sending some probe or some ship out there to space, we are sending microorganisms because they are always contaminated with life. You know, it's virtually impossible to avoid this. Of course, you can say, well, but they are unlikely to be sentient, and if they are microorganisms, and this is correct. But then, you know, they may reach some planet and just remain there, and eventually give rise to, you know, some evolutionary process, and eventually become sentient beings. So it could happen that humans or that descendants, for whatever reason, they disappear from Earth, but they plant the seeds of sentient life out there that could make it the case that a huge amount of suffering occur that would be totally preventable. And in fact, something that you see is that, you know, discussions about things like panspermia and so on, they typically are very optimistic. They typically think about this thinking, well, it's going to be great. We're going to create life. And this happens because people tend to think that maybe because their lives are going well, or they think that their lives are going well, they tend to think that the lives of everyone else are going equally well. And this is not so. And this is certainly not so for many animals, maybe for the majority of animals, right? So there is a huge risk in this, yeah.
And bringing it back down to this planet, so you at the start of your talk, you talked about the sort of total number of animals in the wild, right, and how there's a lot of them. Do you know how changes in human population impact the total number, or the amount of wild animals? Do you know if historically the increase in the human population has had a significant impact either way? Do you know in the future maybe how human population changes may impact wild animal numbers?
Yeah, so that's a good one. So, well, I mean, it's sometimes argued that human action has reduced the number of wild animals, and it may be that in the last decades this has happened because of the use of certain chemicals and fishing and so on. It may be that the numbers of the animals that are more numerous, or the sentient animals that are more numerous, that may be arthropods, both on the land and in the oceans, have been reduced. However, this may change with climate change. The reason is this. Let me just. This is an important caveat. All this is very speculative. We don't know for certain. I mean, I'm just speculating. I mean, you can say, well, it's an informed guess, but it's just a guess nevertheless. But there are different factors that we could consider here. So one is that in the oceans, because of the increase in the temperature of the waters, we can expect that there will be fewer animals, significantly fewer animals, because there are more animals when waters are colder. That's why many animals go to feed in the Arctic or Antarctic oceans. This has to do with the presence of oxygen and so on. Well, we don't need to get into that. And then the coastal areas, as they will be affected, it's possible that there will be fewer animals there, though here it's less clear and so on. But then what happens is that when you consider continents, when you consider the land, things are different because of the ways in which continents at this point in the Earth history are distributed through the surface of the Earth. So what happens is that right now there are wide masses of land that are very high north, mainly Siberia and then Alaska and Canada, right? So it is happening already that ecosystems that were in the south, they are colonizing the north progressively. So for instance, beavers are occupying further northern places. So it's very likely then that the number of animals that are present in these land masses will increase very significantly. And especially if this leads to an increase in arthropods, then the number of animals could be much higher. It's true that deserts in other areas, in tropical areas and so on, can expand and all that. So the south of Europe will become more desertic and so on. But then, the north of Russia will become much more habitable. I think it was Putin who said, "Oh yeah, climate change is going to be great for Russia." So, yeah.
Yeah. I don't know how much research there is about wild animal contraceptive use in marine animals as compared to terrestrial or amphibious animals. Do you know how well contraceptive technology can be used in marine animals, especially those animals that are harder to access, the ones in the deep ocean?
No, I don't know about that. So I haven't read or heard any study about it. That doesn't mean they don't exist. It's just that I'm such an ignorant person. But maybe they don't exist. Maybe they don't exist.
Yeah.
I haven't read of it. Oh, and by the way, just one thing. I didn't quite answer your previous question.
Okay.
I mean, I did answer your question, but I think you were worried about whether by preventing humans from increasing their numbers, we are promoting that the numbers of animals expand. Right.
And
I didn't address that directly, though I kind of address it indirectly. So I wanted to add this. This is like a footnote to my previous response. So it would be hard. It would be very difficult to provide like a yes or no answer to this thing that you didn't answer, that you didn't ask this, but I think this is what you had in your mind. So we don't have a clear answer to that. But yeah, there are these considerations to take into account. In addition to the fact, of course, that more humans mean more animals being exploited and so on. Sorry for coming back to the previous question, but I just thought it would be useful.
No, not at all. So often I know when I suspect that you get this sort of pushback in general when you're talking about intervention in the lives of wild animals, but I think people will be particularly concerned about it when it comes to contraception, which is the idea of the autonomy of the wild animals. I think especially the layperson who maybe has an idyllic view of nature, so maybe they need to see the first part of your presentation to really be understanding the lay of the land. But what do you think the ethics are of use in wild animals when it comes to, as some people may say, the violation of their autonomy?
Yeah. So, well, there are different considerations to be taken, to take into account there. So, first thing, even if, let's suppose that autonomy is something important that we should take into account, and that it is true that we are somehow, violating their autonomy by providing contraception to these animals. Even if these were so, there would be other things that would be very important, such as the huge amount of suffering that will take place if we don't do this, right? This is very significant. We are talking about, suppose that an animal is going to lay, 1,000 eggs or 10,000 eggs. We are talking about, on average, 9,000 or 9,900 and something animals who will die probably when they're very young. If it's just 1,000, then it's going to be 990 something. So, at some point, the weight of those interests should count for something, to think that, respecting that right to autonomy, if that right exists, cannot wait, no matter how much suffering and premature death there is, seems to be implausible. And because the figures are so staggering, so huge, it looks like they would outweigh that, right? So that would be one consideration. But then, concerning autonomy, autonomy is important because it allows you to live your life freely. But the thing is that your autonomy can be, frustrated in many different ways. I mean, if you want to lead a happy life, but you can't because you are under huge stresses due to lack of everything or everything you need in order to live well, like you don't have food availability, water availability, and all that. So it would look weird to say, well, I'm autonomous to just die here, And bear in mind also that this is important because when we provide contraceptives to animals, it's not only their descendants that we are helping those animals themselves. For instance, suppose they are birds in some urban area. If they reproduce by having many offspring, there will be many more birds, and this will mean that they will have, on average, each bird will have less food, fewer places to take shelter, and so on. So it's better for them not to have more offspring, right? On top of that, as I mentioned before, sometimes contraception may be the only way that can allow us to help them without causing more harm. Meaning that if we don't use contraception, maybe we will decide that we shouldn't have them at all. So it's better for them to be helped and to be provided contraception, right? So when you consider all these things, it looks like odd to say that respect for the animal's autonomy should prevent us from saving the very lives, maybe, or crucial elements of the well-being of the very animals whose autonomy we are supposed to be defending, and of many others that will come into existence afterwards.
And what do you think? I think one of them we've already kind of touched on, but what do you think are the unanswered questions that really need to be answered when it comes to population ethics with wild animals?
Well, I think that, just to start with, I think that population ethics works with non-human animals just like it works with humans. So I don't think we should accept different principles for humans and for non-human animals. What happens, though, is that in factual terms, the situation of non-human animals and humans is difficult. In fact, to be a bit more accurate, the situation of animals who have very bad lives and animals who, on average, don't have very bad lives, the factual circumstances involved there are very different. And we are within one group. We are among the animals who don't typically have these horrible lives. I mean, even though our lives may be bad enough, right? But humans, maybe chimpanzees, elephants are the lucky guys, So, so I think that then, in order to answer your question, two different fields remain there to be addressed. One is concerning theoretical population ethics, and another one has to do with the lives of animals, issues related to population dynamics, and so on. So the latter has been addressed already by studies in the science of ecology and life history theory and all that. And what we need is to translate the knowledge that has been gained in those fields in terms of well-being, right? In terms of positive or negative welfare for the animals. So when we look at some study saying, okay, well, these animals populations vary in this way and this other way, well, that's some knowledge that if we approach it with the viewpoint of welfare biology or wild animal welfare science, can tell us a lot about how the lives of animals really are. So this work here that would involve, for instance, literature reviews, translating it to the language of well-being would be very, very useful. And when it comes to theoretical population ethics, I think that there is a lot of work there that should be done. And I've been doing some work on this in coming up with models in population axiology and population ethics that are less simplified, less idealized, and include factors such as uncertainty, such as inequality, and also the distinction between the different components of welfare. So it's not enough to say that in a certain population, a net level of well-being is this and that. It would be interesting to see what are the components of that net level of well-being. That is happiness and suffering, Because then if you come up with a model and say, well, it would be good if a population C or Z would exist, that would be composed of a very large number of individuals, but, well, they would have, if barely, net positive levels of well-being. Well, in practice, if we want to promote that, what we will make it the case is that that's the average, but there will be many individuals who will have net negative levels of well-being and will be suffering a great deal, a huge lot. So I think this kind of work that is more theoretical is also important.
And what are your, obviously we're at the Antinatalist Advocacy Conference. What are your views generally, or what is your understanding generally of antinatalism, and how do you think, if it does at all, link to wild animals?
Well, so the thing with antinatalism is that it can be approached from many different viewpoints. And if you consider antinatalism as applied for humans, there are certain respects in which it can be good for other sentient beings, in that the number of them that will be harmed by humans will be reduced if there are fewer humans. Some people say, well, but if there are no humans around, the number of animals that will continue to suffer will not go below a certain number, because humans will no longer be there to help them. I can see this argument, but then I can also see how humans can cause a lot of suffering also to animals by multiplying significantly the number of animals that there are around. Imagine, for instance, if all these plants that I mentioned before concerning panspermia do occur. But then also, I don't think that, I think it's very unlikely that people, at least for the time being, in the foreseen future, will not continue to bring other new individuals into existence. So I think that the efforts that you guys are doing may mean that fewer people reproduce. But since some people will continue to reproduce, this objection wouldn't really apply. Of course, there would be other considerations that are maybe just tangential here, such as the fact that maybe if you don't have kids, you will have a lot of money that you would otherwise be using in raising those kids, and you can use them to create a better situation for animals or for anyone else. I mean, you can make the world a better place with that, with those resources. So that would be another factor to take into account. But yeah, I mean, there are many different issues to be considering here.
And for my final question, it's a bit of a double-barreled one. So the first part of it is, for the people watching now, what can they do as individuals to help wild animals? And, you know, if they have a particular interest in contraceptive use in wild animals, I don't know if there is a specific way they can help with that. So yeah, what can we as individuals do to help? And what are you working on at the moment?
Well, that's not really one question. Those are
I know. It's kind of two, but I tried to disguise it.
One. Yeah. So I think I'll be able to address the first one only, because
okay.
I understand I just have a couple of minutes,
yeah,
and I won't be able to respond to both things in such a short time. But
cool.
Basically, there are a bunch of things that people can do to help animals, and also to promote that contraception is used with animals. So first, they can convince others to join them and to run some campaign to implement this program in a certain area. Maybe, with birds in a certain town or city, maybe with other animals like deer, like maybe hawks and so on, like boars. This is something that has been done. So we need more people, especially we need more animal advocates and more people interested in improving the situation of animals to, support these kind of campaigns. In addition, I think that we should have a long-termist approach to these and other problems. So I think that the work that organizations like, for instance, the one I work with, Animal Ethics, are doing is very important. So supporting these organizations, volunteering for them, or maybe donating for them would be extremely important. also doing things like helping to spread information about the work they do, like helping others to learn about the posts that Animal Ethics or maybe other organizations like Wild Animal Initiative publish, their videos and so on. Well, that would be helpful. I mean, there are many different ways, really, in which you can collaborate with the works others are doing. And if you work in academia, there is a whole lot that you can do researching in these topics, especially if you are in the natural science, if you are in biology, the science of ecology, or veterinary sciences, you could help a great deal. So, yeah, I mean, lots of things that could be done. Unfortunately, we don't have a lot of time to address them. But yes, I mean, I hope to have provided at least some ideas for people to look for more information later. You can visit, as I said, Animal Ethics website, and yeah, I think that would be it. Thanks for the question, and thanks for the other questions as well.
Thank you so much, Oscar. So if there's actually any links that you want to get to people for things that you want to see or ways they can help, we'll be sending out a newsletter. So if you just send those links over to me, I'll include them and people can have them. But I'll definitely include animal ethics. But yeah, thank you so much for the presentation and for answering your questions. It was really informative and I really enjoyed it.
Well, thank you very much, and yeah, good luck with the rest of the conference.
Thank you.
Back everyone to our panel discussion, and welcome. I'm getting a bit of background from someone. Mind muting yourselves just while you're not speaking. So hopefully she cut out the background noise. Sounds good. Great. Yeah, thank you all of you so much for joining me. I'll give a quick introduction to the panel and then we'll dive into today's questions. So the topic of this panel, as you'll have all seen from the agenda, is building a healthy antinatalist community. And there are some key questions embedded into the topics of this panel. What would a healthy antinatalist community look like? Like, how do we practically get there? And answering these questions is putting them into practice, however, as anyone who's been involved in communities revolving around a moral or social issue, this is much easier said than done. Having a healthy antinatalist community is in all of our interests, both in terms of our own engagement with the community, but also its capacity to be able to do things. And that's why we view nurturing a healthy community as a top priority for antinatalist advocacy, even though it will be no easy thing. Fortunately, there are many people who wish to see the same thing come to fruition, and we've convened a panel of them here today. So we've got three interesting and experienced people in the antinatalist community and other communities as well. And we're hoping that you can shed some light on how we can build the healthier antinatalist community that we would all like to see. So I'll give a quick introduction to all three of our panelists. So first, on the right of my screen, Amanda Sukanik is an American sculptor and a video artist who's been producing antinatalist content since 2010. She created the 2016 movie, The Ethicalist, and is the host of the Exploring Antinatalism podcast, which is now at 80 episodes, unless one has come out recently, or is it still at 80? There or thereabouts.
On the way.
On the way. More recently, she's collaborated heavily with antinatalist philosopher Matti Hairi, who was obviously on our conference yesterday. And together they've published the paper Imposing a Lifestyle, a New Argument for Antinatalism, and they have an upcoming book, Antinatalism, Extinction, and the End of Procreated Self-Corruption. Below me on the screen, we're joined by Ash Wickerty. Ash is an antinatalist activist and organizer, also from the States. Ash has done extensive work with Stop Having Kids, including organizing in-person street outreach. And she's also an experienced and dedicated animal rights activist in the States and was the co-host of the former MN Intersectional podcast. Just wanted to make sure I pronounced the title correctly, Ash. It was MN
Intersectional.
Intersectional. Sounds good. And then lastly, on the bottom right of my screen is Shweta Ramkumar, joining us from Melbourne, Australia. Shweta is a child-free advocate who's been involved in organising and maintaining both online and in-person child-free communities. She's travelled across the globe, working in a variety of industries, and is currently a business entrepreneur. Shweta has also experienced breaking free from disempowering cultural conformity through choosing a child-free lifestyle whilst being a member of the South Asian diaspora. So thank you very much for joining us, Shweta. And I understand that you have to leave at 8:40 to go, well, 8:40 UK time. It's obviously much different time zone in Australia. So we'll make sure to get to your questions before then. So my first question, actually, before we get to those questions, just a quick note on format for the audience. So the way it's going to work is I'm going to ask a question and then direct it to someone first to give their first comments, then obviously open it to the floor. But this first one is for all three of you. And that is, what are the key characteristics of a healthy community and why should we want one? So Amanda, as you're first up on my screen, would you like to go first?
I would love to. So first off, I want to say thank you so much, John, and a hello to Ash. Lovely to see you, and a hello to Shweta. It's love to finally meet you. So in attempting to answer this question and in an attempt to sort of diagnose and answer this broader question of, how do we build a broader antinatalist community, I prepared a little bit of what I believe to sort of be a statement on the state of where we are in antinatalism currently. It's a little bit of a spiel, but I'll go quickly and then hand it off to my lovely co-panelists. So building a healthy antinatalist community, my diagnosis, sadly, regrettably, is that I think we are a very long way away from an antinatalist community that is ready to receive a clean bill of health. I think we lack focus. I think we're incredibly adversarial with one another. We can't agree on anything, and we lack goals. That's not to say that building a healthy antinatalist community is impossible, and that's not to say that there haven't been some extremely encouraging recent developments. This conference, which has nurtured so much positive conversation on so many of really the most challenging and controversial aspects of antinatalism today, is a real step in the right direction. Communication is, I think, a key part of the prescription for curing what ails antinatalism. But regardless, I think we're going to have to apply a very great deal of determination and patience if a healthy antinatalist community is in fact what we want to create. So listen, we have real issues. We have huge disagreements. In fact, I don't think as a community we can agree on much of anything. What I believe might be evidence of health within the community is likely entirely different than what my fellow panelists may believe, let alone what the constituent members of our fine audience might believe. Some of us think that in addition to being a philosophical movement, antinatalism should be an organized social movement as well. Others are extremely opposed to that concept, the concept of antinatalist activism in any way, shape, or form. Some of us are extinctionists. Some of us are sentient extinctionists, even, or reverse biocentric extinctionists. Others want nothing to do with any of that and don't even think that those subjects should be talked about at all. Some of us want to genetically engineer humans in the hopes that procreation could be turned ethical. Others don't think that that's even possible and are concerned that there might be extra ethical concerns, along the way for that plan as well. Some of us firmly believe that animals and animal interventionism is part of antinatalism. Others firmly do not. There are really radical forms of antinatalism and not so radical forms of antinatalism, and you have very radical adjacent, maybe or not, ideas connected to antinatalism, like promortalism, which I think contemporary antinatalism has done very little to fully contend with, quite frankly. You have antinatalism, vehement ephilism, child-free, anti-AI natalism, and activism, maybe sort of a little bit, all competing with one another. And these are huge divides with very little historical precedent so far of these constituent elements being able to do anything other than war against each other and distance themselves from one another. No hope of working towards goals or even agreeing that there should be goals in the first place. Compounding that, we have a very serious illness in the form of an overarching fear problem that has plagued contemporary antinatalism since the very beginning, and I believe will continue to cripple us for a long time to come. People are afraid to be antinatalists. People are afraid to speak about antinatalism, and our attrition and recidivism rates, as far as people leaving the community at least, are very, very high. The social cost of antinatalism is not a currency people can afford to invest in. So we have real problems. And in my opinion, these are problems that must be addressed and that we must find a way of ameliorating, because antinatalism as both a philosophy and as a social movement have very important jobs to do. And that is doing what's best to serve the unborn, preventing lives. And until we can put the unborn first over whatever discomforts we may have with one another, I don't believe we can ever truly be a healthy antinatalist community. And I pass it on to the next speaker.
Thanks so much, Amanda. And that definitely has answered a fair few of my questions that I had here. Ash, I've got you next on my screen. Would you like to talk about what are the key characteristics of a healthy community and why we should strive for it?
I definitely agree with a lot of what Amanda said, and I understand that our backgrounds are a little different. I do a lot of the in-person, or trying to build the in-person community. I think a lot of it comes down to communication and being willing to set our differences aside and just kind of focusing on the common goal. And, if we can even agree on a common goal, for me, that would be educating the public more about antinatalism and normalizing it more. If it becomes more commonly spoken about, I think people will feel a lot more comfortable coming forward talking about it. I admittedly, before I got involved in this kind of activism, despite having years experience of doing street activism for animal rights, I was scared. I thought people were going to react really harshly, and I was nervous to get out there. And I will say my experience has been pretty overwhelmingly positive, even more so than a lot of the animal rights issues that I've stood out on the street and talked to people about. And so I think that, the Stop Having Kids group that I organized for, we have a YouTube channel, and that shows a lot of our on the street outreach. And some of that is the more like out there rare occurrences, because that's what gets viewers' attention and gets people talking. But especially in my experience here in Minneapolis, Minnesota, in the US, people seem really ready to have these conversations. And I think just communicating, focusing on a common goal, and putting differences aside and not letting infighting totally destroy our movement if we want to make this more of a mainstream idea.
Great. Thanks, Ash. And Shweta, what are your thoughts on the characteristics of a healthy community and how we can get there?
So Amanda and Ash have covered the antinatalist side of things. I'm just going to give my spin on what I have experienced, which is in the child-free space. So so I have been involved in not just founding, but also sort of supporting a lot of the global communities. Now, I suppose when it comes to being child-free, in a way, it's probably a little bit easier but then again, it's hard to tell. So because being child-free in isolation is not as extreme as, or is not seen as being as extreme as being antinatalist. So usually when I approach child-free people, the most common thing that they say to me is that they feel very isolated. They feel like they don't have anyone whom they can relate to, because all of their friends are having kids, and as a result, they have grown apart and their lives have changed, their identities have changed. So they look for avenues where they can actually really be themselves, and also places where they can, share things that they cannot openly share with their parent friends. And also, if it's an in-person situation, if they can sort of, network, socialize, and sort of get together from time to time. And that has really been the purpose of what I have contributed in this space. So to really give these people who feel like they're just on their own in terms of their choice, feeling that they're not on their own, and they feel supported and they feel welcomed in the group. So the groups that I have been involved in, they are very diverse and very varied. So even though the broad umbrella is people without children, some of them have included people who were not able to biologically have children for whatever reason, and also some of them, not all, have because they're one of the partners, they have children, so those are included. But that particular group is only for people to, well, not just for that, predominantly for people to really get host events, get together, and do things like that. And through that group, I think we've all come together very nicely, and we've sort of formed like a family, like a tribe, and it's only for women. So it's just a local group of where I live. So here where I live, 1 in 3 people are child-free. So it's very common here to be child-free, and you don't really get a lot of grief for that. So and the group has grown a lot since it came. So it was just started off with 20 of us in 2021, and then now it's about almost 1,000. So and it's just everyone in the same city and or the same state. So we sort of get together from time to time, and like every week there's some event or other. It's up to you whether you can go or not. And also, in the group itself, because they're Facebook groups, the admins will generally put out a question every single week. Things like what was a small win that you had this week. So it's not just being about about being child-free. Obviously, you can, if you're experiencing grief or isolation for being child-free, you can obviously talk about that, but also to provide that support and to provide that real sense of unity and community. There are questions that are posed every week that, celebrate your small wins. What was a highlight of the week? And what was one of the challenges of this week. Now, for example, I post in that group every Wednesday. It could be, a podcast that I have interviewed for, or I might post something quite funny, that's related to being child-free. I might even ask a question. What do you guys think of this? So I do this once a week, but any member can really do that. And some other groups, now this particular group is, it's one of those groups where you cannot discuss antinatalism. And rightly so, because there are people in this group who have not been able to have children for whatever reason. But there are other groups that are more not just within where I live, but also like the broader Australian communities, where they do give this option, where you can speak about antinatalism and where you can have the discussion much more broadly. So yeah, all of these have really served the purpose of making people feel less alone and more connected and united. So I'm really pleased with how far it has come since when it started, and it's only uphill from here, I guess.
Thanks, Shweeta. And I guess I hadn't been considering until you went through like the different ways that people came to the child-free community. I guess I hadn't been considering the diversity within the child-free community, the diversity of experience and perspective. And I was going to wonder, what lessons can we learn from the child-free community, if we can come back to you, Shweeta, about how we can try and resolve conflict within the antinatalist community?
Sorry, am I still answering this question?
Oh, yes. Sorry, I was going to say yes.
Yeah.
If there are any lessons that we can learn in terms of like resolving conflict.
I mean, look, there have been conflicts in our group also, from time to time. I guess for really having really clear guidelines of how much of something negative can we talk about in these groups, because what can happen is when you are child-free, or even when you're antinatalist, you can feel, and I think it's even worse if you're an antinatalist, because you are probably the only one in your group of child-free people who is antinatalist, or you might be one of 5 or 6. So if you sort of put your views forward, some people might get upset or offended by it, but that seems to be for anything and everything nowadays anyway. I guess for having guidelines about how much of negativity you can post in a group, I guess, because that really what starts off the process of conflict to begin with. And people, they tend to disagree, and then one thing or the other happens, and the admin has to switch off the comments and suspend it. It's happened to me. Be the first one to admit where I've done that. And obviously, in one of the groups, one of the child-free groups, I'm actually one of the admin, so I have the power to actually, boot people, block people if I choose to. It's never got to that point, though. It's never been an issue. I guess for me, the other bit of conflict that I have experienced is I was actually part of another child-free group which I had to leave, in about 3 or 4 months' time, because that was one of those groups where I felt that it was very, very pandering and pleasing towards parents. So you couldn't say anything negative about children. You couldn't say anything negative about parents. So those are the groups that, I just absolutely do not, vibe or resonate with that. But there has to be a healthy balance. So, like the groups that I'm a part of, yes, you can talk about, the challenges that you face as a child-free person in a very pronatalist world. But some people just take it too far, and they'll post about 5 or 6 things they'll post on in one day, and in which case the groups that I'm the admin of, I can just boot them. So I can just say we can't do that. And I think communicating in a healthy way without really, I guess, polarizing or dividing people is very important. That the group that I left was very good at doing that. They would just divide people who did not like children or did not respect parents. They would just divide them with the other, and the ones who were of the former group who really respected parents, who really loved kids, they would just look down on the others who don't feel that way. And just having very clear guidelines from the get-go about what the group is about and what will be welcomed and tolerated and what will not be. So having and enforcing those boundaries is really, really important. And also giving consequences to people who don't adhere to that can really go a long way. So that's what I would say can be the basis really of identifying and resolve and managing conflict in these groups. Sure.
That's really helpful, thank you. And I think especially relevant as a lot of antinatalism, well, I couldn't put a percentage on it, but I'd probably say over 99% does exist online. But I did have a question here for you, Ash, and then obviously to open it to the floor as well, around like how, well, maybe this is a bit presumptuous. I'm framing it in a leading way. I was going to say, like, how can we have more of an in-person element? I think I might make it broad and say, should we have more of an in-person element to the antinatalist community? And if so, how can we get there?
I think having more of an in-person presence would definitely be helpful in normalizing antinatalism and getting the word out about it. And I think a lot of that does start online. I'm grateful that we have so many online communities where we can start this. My local Stop Having Kids group, we have a Facebook group where we can bounce ideas off of each other, plan events, things like that. And we've done dine outs, just getting together at a local vegan spot and getting to know each other. And a lot of people who are antinatalists, they have been keeping these feelings inside. Maybe they've chatted about it online, but they haven't had the opportunity to have these discussions in person. And I know how exciting it is to meet other, vegans or antinatalists and being able to kind of just be really honest about your feelings and also learn new things. Like Amanda had mentioned all these different forms of antinatalism. So many don't even know that those exist. I don't even personally know the details about a lot of them. So it's cool to meet in person and be able to have more in-depth discussions without the screen. And I think like getting together to volunteer to work toward a common goal. I mean, we've gone out and pulled buckthorn. It's an invasive plant that was brought here. And it helps, other animals and the environment. So just working together and I think doing projects and like seeing that you completed something or that you improved conditions for somebody else is a really good feeling and it's really unifying. Yeah, and I think also building these friendships shows people that they have support. So what I like to do is if somebody's interested in maybe doing street outreach, but they're not comfortable speaking, I will tell them, hey, come out, hold a sign. If you get in a situation where someone's asking you something, I'll be alert. You can flag me down. You can flag whoever else down who is very comfortable speaking. And that pressure is taken off of them and they can just kind of observe and see how certain things are answered till they build up that own level of comfort within themselves. And even so, just showing that they have that support. Let's say they get in a conversation, but they kind of get stuck on something or, there's other people that they can call in to help them until they get far more comfortable doing that on their own. So yeah, I guess starting online, moving it in person, maybe not focusing on jumping into antinatalist outreach or tabling or things like that, but building that foundation and that trust and that confidence so that you can start having conversations about antinatalism with, everyday people on the street.
Great. Thanks, Ash. And Amanda, Shreeta, any more thoughts on having more of an in-person element to the antinatalist community?
Yeah, I mean, talk about positive developments. I mean, I think Stop Having Kids. I mean, maybe this sort of began really with Vehement. I mean, Vehement, was doing the in-person booths and stuff for a long, long time. But I think, with and the Church of Euthanasia. But I mean, particularly Stop Having Kids has really done so much to bring antinatalism back out into the actual real world, and take it away from the screen. And there's been, I think it's tremendous, like what they've been able to accomplish with the billboards and the signs, and also the inspiration that it's had on, people like Sumit, in India, that there's sort of little chapters popping up all over the world that are really influenced by Stop Having Kids. So it's clearly resonated with people in a big way. I want to see as much of that happen as possible. I want there to be a healthy online antinatalist community, and I want there to be a healthy offline antinatalist community. I've tried to contribute to this in my own ways by having like film screenings and things like that. It's not really my wheelhouse, but yeah, I want to see as much of that happen as possible. I don't think that it's going to fix some of the big problems that the community has. I mean, maybe I'm a little bit of a pessimist. I don't know, but I just am a little bit not sure if it's exactly what's going to cure a lot of the issues. And I think part of why I'm a little bit skeptical is that I've just seen so much evidence over the years of the fear problem. And I think as antinatalism becomes a more widely known concept in the world, as media attention grows, which I mean, just in this last year, it's grown significantly. I think the stakes are going to be higher for people to be, to create identities, known identities around this subject. But look, I mean, this in-person antinatalism has come a tremendously long way. I mean, if I think back to 2011, there was a very well-known YouTuber that was not an antinatalist, but very involved in these conversations. His name was Conference Report, or Fred. And he actually did a whole video series at one point. I think he even had a website called Life Sucks or something like that. No relation to Life Sucks, the artist, where he would, like wear like a pig mask and have signs out on the street saying life sucks, because he was mocking antinatalists for not ever he didn't think antinatalists would ever get to the point where they would have the courage to do something like this. So he was sort of mocking, antinatalists, and there was a belief that if you did something like this, if there were billboards, antinatalists would be shot left and right in the streets. I mean, none of that's come to pass, thankfully. So yeah, so I think it's a great thing. I hope it continues, but I just am I'm a little cautious, and I wonder as to the growth, just where, if there's a stopping point. Yeah, all I can do is say that I will be watching like a hawk every movement in the development of in-person antinatalism, and I hope that it's successful.
Thanks, Amanda. Shweta, do you have any thoughts?
I mean, compared to most people in this panel, I am relatively new to the antinatalist space. I did not even know that it existed. Now, let's take back to when I was a child, and since the second I was born, I knew that I didn't want children. But this is the question I always used to wonder at the back of my head, and also because I think I came from India, which is overpopulated and has its own share of problems. I always used to wonder that, why are people having biological children when there are so many orphans and who are just waiting to be adopted? So even though I didn't know that there was such a term called antinatalism, I think from a young age, I was probably one, but only in 2020, when I learned more about what antinatalism was. And this was because a lot of people, they saw my work and they exposed me to it. And I was like, yeah, it makes perfect sense. I guess for me, a lot of people I know in the child-free community have expressed interest in, can we start a Stop Having Kids chapter over here? And, I'm completely on board with that. Now, for me personally, that is something that I'm very time pressed. I have a lot of other priorities now, and I absolutely cannot commit to creating another community and, making sure because it's a lot of work. And also, I think, it can really be, where I think it can be problematic is that it can really be seen as you're almost sort of trying to, yes, the whole purpose is to raise awareness, yes, about what antinatalism is and why it should be normalized. But also when you're sort of telling people that, to join or get more curious, it can be really seen as you're sort of trying to build a cult, or, you can really, you're sort of trying to push our agenda down on them. That's where I think we can run into a little bit of a problem in this situation. So even though, I mean, if I was randomly walking around on the street and I saw a sign like that, because it resonates with me, I would definitely go and inquire about what this is all about and sort of join in. But I think even if you draw the analogy with our free spaces, we did sort of meet online first, and then it sort of diverged in person. And that, I think, setting that foundation is very important, that people are on the same page and they're all sort of well aligned, and then you sort of do as an event. Now, look, if people in my circle, my child-free circle, if they do want to start like a Stop Having Kids chapter locally, 100%, I would, I'll start with, I would probably support starting with like the sort of get-togethers that Ash was mentioning, but to really sort of, and then they can all sort of pitch in their ideas, how we can spread the message on a global level, on a broader level in our local communities and things like that. So yeah, it should be done in such a way that we're not being perceived as some activists who are really wanting to have our own agenda that way. It's mainly to raise awareness, but I guess that's where the work really needs to be done. How to do it in a way where the focus really is on raising awareness, and it's not really to judge people for their choices and think, guilt tripping, fear mongering. I think that's where a lot of the work would need to be done.
May I add something to that really briefly? I first of all, I just want to say, like, I'm so happy that we have a representative from the child-free community here with us on the panel. I mean, unfortunately, child-free and antinatalism are very heavy territorialized against each other often, not always. I mean, like Lenora, with child-free girls, I mean, there's been some really good movement towards combining the two over the last couple of years. But I mean, for the most part, the territorialization has been pretty extreme, between the two groups. They kind of often want nothing to do with each other. And part of the resulting thing from that is that there's been this tremendous gender divide in antinatalism, where there's like antinatalism is for men and child-free is for women. And I just think that is so toxic to what both sides are trying to build. And so, like, especially if there's any kind of movement towards like worrying about like a cultish appearance or anything. I mean, I don't know, like any amount of being able to voice these things from a male perspective, from a female perspective, from a collective of both genders and all genders, not just male and female identifying people. I mean, that's a huge step in the right direction of normalizing this thing. But unfortunately, I mean, that's a huge deterritorializing antinatalism and child-free is tremendously controversial because people want them kept separate. And I just think that's a huge mistake. I don't think it serves the unborn at all, really. I think all it does is serve really useless divides and ego. And yeah, so I think that would be a great push in the right direction.
Oh, definitely. And that is something that I did notice as well, because I do remember listening to a child-free podcast where they said that they felt that the child-free spaces were mostly dominated by women. And then when I came into antinatalism, I saw quite the opposite. So again, just from my own anecdotal experience. And I found that very, very strange. I didn't mean to interrupt you, Ash. Sorry, I think you were just coming off mute. Oh, great. Shweta, I'm worried about your... not worried, wary of your time. So now you do have to head off to work. So one thing that I was going to ask, you did talk a bit about people coming into, well, obviously growing the child-free community down in Melbourne. So I was wondering about how, and again, this might already been covered by various topics that we discussed earlier, but how can the antinatalist community ensure that new members find it easy to integrate and then they remain within the community? Because I think, as Amanda, you mentioned, there's a very high turnover rate within the antinatalist community, unfortunately. So I guess, yeah, from your experience with the child-free community, Shweta, and just in general, what can we do to make sure that people feel welcome and they want to stick around?
I mean, I can sort of draw an analogy of how the group that I am a part of, where it's just women who don't have children. So when new members join and someone, one of the admins, I'm not one of them, I'm not one of the admins in the group, and they will sort of send out a generic message. So they'll keep track of who the new members are, and they will send out a generic message of just DM them and ask, just make them feel welcome. Open to asking any questions, and also, like, for a lot of people, just meeting in person. And I think this has worsened after COVID because people now really hesitate to interact with each other in person, and they have a lot of anxieties and fears. And and I think for the person who actually does this welcome in our group, she was one of them too. When during our very first meetup, she experienced a lot of fear and anxiety, and then she could sort of share her experience with the new members on how they can sort of be best prepared, and also just reiterate the fact that this is a welcoming supportive community. And as long as you meet these two, you will identify as a woman. No matter what your gender is, you can be non-binary, you can be transgender or anything like that. And whatever your life choices are, we never talk about very extreme things like politics and religion and things like that. And even in this particular group, we leave out antinatalism because the purpose of the group is completely different. So, and I think that is what having that principle where someone from the admin is in charge of actually making the new members feel welcome, and even schedule a call with the new members and ask them how they feel about the group, just answering any questions and just putting their mind at ease when they do actually meet in person. So that can be a very good strategy to sort of move forward. And I guess for when it comes to antinatalism, the question that I really have is that because like Amanda mentioned, there is an intersectionality between child-free and antinatalism, but also there is that divide and toxicity, because there are a lot of people who are parents or who are also antinatalists. So I suppose, where do you draw the line? Like, would you, in a community that's like that, and is the purpose really to bring like-minded people together, or is it to raise awareness and really spread the message that what bringing more humans does to the world? So having that clarity of which direction it's going in. Like for me, in the groups that I'm a part of, each group has a different purpose and a different meaning. So one is really the broader group where you can obviously share your grievances, your problems, and whatever else. And the other group is where it's for in-person events and for women, unfortunately, and things like what you can do, and just day-to-day problems that you might experience. So yeah, so I guess having those clear guidelines and boundaries, and I think when new members join in, you have to actually also be very transparent, let people know what this is going to be about and what we don't want and what we do want. So just having just from the get-go, just make it very make it very obvious and clear of what the expectations are. And I think just from a very from the early stages, just make them feel supported and welcome, so that the nerves and anxiety sort of reduce in the future.
Ash, Amanda, anything to add?
Not much to add. She said it well. Just making people feel included, making them feel welcome, making them feel heard. Find out maybe somebody's strengths and how they can apply that to whatever your goal is. And yeah, that's about it.
I think those are all excellent ideas towards a path forward of trying to make people feel more welcome. I think it's a little harder with antinatalism because some of the, I think we should be trying to find a version of this thing that speaks to the most people, that people can find agreeable enough to actually go, you know what, I'm not going to procreate. That probably would be best. The problem is that some of the more extreme forms of antinatalism are able to address different forms of suffering that less extreme versions do. So it's like, if we find a less extreme version of antinatalism that might speak to more people, are we also saying we're not going to be able to do anything about wild animal suffering or factory farming, or does it mean that we have to cut veganism out? Does it mean that we have to not talk about extinction? Does it mean that we AI antinatalism? All of these different forms of suffering may never be addressed if antinatalism becomes smaller and more consumable. And I want antinatalism to be as consumable as possible because I want to prevent lives and I want to do well by the unborn. But I also, my antinatalism covers a lot of forms of unborn creatures. And so, and I don't think that it's healthy to ignore or shove off, some of the more difficult subjects. I think that's exactly, I think part of the incredible strength of this conference is that it's faced those subjects. It's faced some of the most controversial and challenging subjects within antinatalism. So needless to say, I'm a little bit torn. I think that we as individual activists, we need to move forward with a principle of kindness and compassion, understanding as best that we possibly can. Mati and I write about that in our paper, imposing a lifestyle, and in our upcoming book. But it's difficult because, again, I think that, again, trying to make this thing as consumable as possible may also come with a sacrifice to the full range of good that this philosophy actually is capable of achieving.
Thanks, Amanda. And I've just got one question here, and Shweta, I know you have to go, so I'm going to quickly ask you this one first. Again, this is something we may have already covered, but what would you say if there was one key lesson that we could learn from another community? What would it be?
Look, there is no perfect community. I can say that from the child-free space and everything that I've been involved in. And this is just me personally. Now, for me, I am always an advocate of making communities smaller, intentional, and well-aligned. So I'm just going to give you an example of a business group that I'm a part of. So the business group literally has 60 people. That's it. And it is one of the most positive, one of the most supportive communities. Yes, obviously, to get to be a part of the group, you have to pay and everything like that. But still, that is in that group. It's you can really see that level of support, that level of positivity in that group. Whereas in all of the other child-free communities that I have been a part of, there's just there are ups and downs. Like there are things that there's no real. Sometimes groups are just created for the heck of it, and to so that people just feel less alone. And they'll ask new members. They'll be required to ask answer some questions, and then they let in or whatever. And then and the problem is when the bigger a group becomes, it's harder to manage. You can't possibly make every single person feel welcome if you're having a group of 20,000 people. That's just not going to happen. So I guess the number of groups is one thing, but also being intentional and clear about what the group is going to be about. And and I think smaller groups, or even like a medium-sized group where there is cohesion and intimacy, that's really important, because you don't want to be in a group where you're just there and all you're doing is just reading other people's posts and you're posting, and it just is a bit of a negative environment in that situation. So personally, I'm an advocate of having smaller groups, minimalist groups, and really intentional groups which is manageable, where there is true unity and cohesion and intimacy is what. But I am aware that it's not for everybody. But that this is just my principle. That anything that's small and manageable is really the way to go.
Great, and thank you so much, Shweta, for joining us today. Any final words before you go?
Well, thank you so much for having me, and yes, I will look forward to seeing the recording now.
Great.
Nice meeting
Thanks,
you, Shweta.
All right.
Take care.
Yeah, bye-bye.
Great. So I'll fire that question both to you. What would you say is the key lesson that we can learn from other communities?
Ash, you want to go first?
Sure. I think infighting is a massive problem. I've seen it time and time again in the animal rights space. And I think just kind of getting ahead of that, realizing that some people just want to stir up drama and controversy and divide people. And I'm not going to stand for that, at least in my community, if I can avoid it. We want to nip that in the bud as soon as possible. We're up against so much already outside of our communities that we don't need to be tearing ourselves apart from the inside. That's what people who don't agree with our philosophy or ideas want to see. So let's not give them that. Let's agree to disagree on some things. And again, just kind of focus on what our goal is.
And Ash, you're either a very good ventriloquist or your camera has frozen. But we heard you nice and clearly, so don't worry about that. Amanda?
Yeah, well, I'm glad Ash ended on the word goals, because that's exactly where I wanted to take this. So I think, while things are still online or still kind of growing in an in-person context, we can do the best we can. It's going to be what it's going to be. But I think once, hopefully, we get to a point where we're moving towards goals, and I do hope antinatalism does that. And again, that's a very controversial thing to say, I realize, and I'm not suggesting that goal be extinction, not yet anyway. I do hope at some point antinatalism takes on shades of what American anthropologist David Aberle would call a reformative social movement, and one that does things like, perhaps this is just one idea, work towards like legal and financial protections for people without children. That is something that we could work towards it now, and perhaps achieve that. And I think, I think in order to do something like that, we would have to do, I think, something similar to what activists of marriage equality had to do. There was an incredibly huge division within that community, an incredible amount of infighting and aggression and all that, believe it or not. And it wasn't until Andrew Cuomo, believe it or not, basically, stuck it to them, saying, look, I will make this a feature of my career to try to achieve this if you guys can just get your acts together and work together. And so in an effort to try to achieve a common goal, the constituent members of these different LGBT plus QIA groups had to sign what was called a memorandum of understanding to commit to a point to get the job done. And they did that, and they were able to, and hopefully it will never be taken away. So I don't expect us to ever come to a point where we all agree with one another. But I do hope that we get to a point where we believe in achieving goals enough that that something like that might be possible, and that we can actually start getting real things in the world done, because we absolutely have that potential, and we should.
Right. And one theme that has come up across the different questions, obviously the problems of infighting, the problems of not having shared goals, this kind of thing. And I do wonder if a potential solution could be small, like not quite localized in terms of geography, but small groups or small people who share particular aims with under the broad banner of antinatalism, that are maybe quite carefully moderated, or not even moderated, but have those shared goals, but still come under that antinatalist banner. And so long as there is like a generally healthy like overall kind of vibe in the antinatalist community, I could potentially see people who are maybe motivated towards one particular thing moving, in that direction without, needing to, as you're saying, Amanda, boil down to the lowest common denominator, which in antinatalism, I don't even know what that would be. I was trying to think of it there. In terms of a goal, I think there are generally like shared views in terms of recognizing the harms of coming into existence. But then in terms of factoring that into a goal, I wonder if you could have a series of small, well-managed spaces within the antinatalist community that somehow don't fight with the other small spaces. I don't know if this is a pipe dream, but what are your thoughts on that?
I'll go real quick. I think that's kind of what we have now, and I think they become echo chambers. And I think that, there's a lot of antinatalist Facebook groups, like really a significant number of them, and most of them are dead, but yeah, they're highly territorialized. Everything in antinatalism is highly territorialized. So again, I just think that the real challenge is going to be hopefully a desire coming up to actually wanting to achieve something bigger than but I don't know. I don't know what that push is going to be. I don't know what that impetus is going to be, but I do hope we get there. Yeah. Sorry, Ash, go ahead.
You're good. I honestly don't really have much to add to that. I agree with what both of you said, and I just hope that this movement will continue to grow. It's cool to see some of the mainstream media and people who have a lot of followers mentioning it, like to know that we're such a small portion of the population, but it is, catching the attention of people. That's, I don't know, kind of exciting.
Just on the note of infighting and getting along, how do we as a community address things that people would certainly disagree with, say like rampant misogyny or something like that, or like violent fantasies or threats within the community? And how do we deal with generally problematic behavior without broadening that to general disagreement, if that makes sense. How do we distinguish between the two, and who does the distinguishing? Just to give an example, like, for example, I personally don't appreciate seeing hatred towards children within antinatalist spaces, but I can understand why some people might, for example, think that that might not cross the line as something that would be bannable from a group. So how do we regulate what we might see as toxic behavior without crossing the line into just trampling people's expression?
Yeah, I mean, this is really complicated. I mean, I think people should make active statements against those kinds of things that they find that they vehemently, no pun intended, disagree with. But I mean, it's, the hatred of children thing. I mean, one thing I want to point out is that, in addition to a fear problem, we also kind of have a moderation problem in antinatalism where, like I am a moderator of r/antinatalism, where a lot of the hatred for children and parents comes up, and it is a real problem. But how do you moderate 200,000 people? Without, if you also plan on being a content producer and, maybe like wanting to eat and go outside sometimes. And, and so, people want these groups to be better. People want the community to be better, but they don't necessarily want to put in the time and the effort to do the work that's going to take. And as far as removing, elements of the community or members of the community that may espouse, truly egregious views and stuff. I mean, I think there's, Tehran was a Nazi. Arthur Schopenhauer actually did throw a woman down a flight of stairs. I've brought that up a number of times to people, and people tell me, don't talk about that because you might hurt Schopenhauer. So, I mean, I think we got a lot of apologetics going on. I mean, and yes, yes, like many of my friends have said things that I don't agree with. So I think we need to just be really good at openly disagreeing with those things and calling them out. I mean, I think that's perfectly reasonable. But I also don't think you're going to get rid of that kind of stuff, unfortunately. But I also think normalizing, deterritorializing child-free and antinatalism so that more women can be a part of antinatalism, that's going to take care of some of this. Unfortunately, if you maintain that divide for the sake of, I don't know, academic antinatal purity, which I think is a big part that drives that, I don't think we're going to get anywhere to curing that. And as far as, a hatred of parents, I mean, it's really nice when we don't have to use words like breeders and everybody is very understanding and stuff. And I think we should do that as much as possible. But I also think we have to acknowledge that antinatalism is an expression sometimes for a lot of people of a kind of ancient, unexpressed, for the most part, rage. And like that hasn't had anywhere to go for a long time. And you just have to expect that people are going to be angry and that they're going to express that. And I don't know. I fully admit, I don't know exactly the best way to deal with that in a healthy manner, but I think that we can't be surprised by it because it's an inevitability, unfortunately. So go ahead, Ash. I'm sorry.
I think for me, I've had it a bit easier because I haven't had to manage really large groups of people. So for example, like our Stop Having Kids demos, it could be 2 of us to maybe 8 or 9 of us. And for us, like we're very much like, let people kind of do what they want, but stay true to our core message and values. Like we have a sign that says no hate for parents or kids. So our group needs to act that way. We're not saying, anything bad about kids or how much we hate kids or they're annoying or whatever. Like, let's try to keep it a little more positive. So yeah, I've had it a lot easier. I haven't had any conflict. I haven't really had anybody act out at any of my demos. We even have somebody who joins us who isn't antinatalist. She very much agrees that, we shouldn't be reproducing at the rate that we are, but she knows that when she comes to the demos, like the message is antinatalism and educating people on that. And she sticks true to that. So that's been really nice too. So yeah, I'm hoping it can continue this way, but yeah, it's kind of inevitable especially in online spaces. And it's unfortunate because people from outside the community peek in and they see that, and then they want to act as if all antinatalists feel this way, and it kind of gives us a bad look. And yeah, hopefully more people will feel comfortable stating their stance and showing that no, like actually you can love kids and also be antinatalist and not want to have kids of your own, or you can be someone who had kids and later realize so many things, just like eating animals. I did that for 25 years of my life, and then I came to these realizations and was like, wow, if I had known this, I wouldn't have done this. And it's the same for parents. So yeah, I think that just giving people some grace comes in very handy.
And that was, it's a really positive note to end on. I was just going to say that one of the things that I do think that can potentially help as a community is just by acting like a nice person. And we do all get it wrong. I certainly do go on the odd rant from behind my keyboard from time to time, but just a bit of kindness and compassion really goes a long way. Just wanted to thank you both so much, and a huge thank you to Shweta as well, who obviously dropped off earlier. Really hope everyone enjoyed this panel discussion. Please let us know if you'd like more kind of discussions in this format for future iterations of AAC. And we will join you. We'll be back in a few minutes for our final session of the conference with Magnus Vinti.
Thank you, John. Thank you, Ash. Thank you, Shweta.
Thanks, everyone.
Okay, so welcome to the final session of the Antinatalist Advocacy Conference 2023. I'm joined by Magnus Vinding. Now, I'm sure many people are familiar with Magnus's work. I'm going to give a quick introduction to Magnus, and then we are going to go into a conversation. So this session will be slightly different from other ones. This will be a conversation rather than a presentation, as it were. So, so Magnus has written books such as Effective Altruism, How Can We Best Help Others, Suffering-Focused Ethics, Defense and Implications, which is a lot of what we're going to be talking about today, and Reasoned Politics. So a wide variety of topics. Magnus has also written a wide variety of essays, which I'm sure many people in the audience will be familiar with, especially essays such as The Speciesism of Leaving Nature Alone and The Theoretical Case for Wildlife Antinatalism. Magnus also in conference. We will hope to get to some at the end. But yeah, I think without further ado, we can get into it. So the first thing I want to say is thank you for coming, Magnus. And I'll start off with the question simply, what is suffering-focused ethics?
Right. So suffering-focused ethics, that's simply a label. It's an umbrella term for ethical views that give special importance to the reduction of suffering. And of course, so that includes, for example, purely consequentialist views, such as negative utilitarianism, but it can also include non-consequentialist views that give great importance to the reduction of suffering. And of course, giving special importance to suffering, that's not in itself super precise, but one can outline, you could say, sort of a continuum of views that are more or less suffering focused. But like the way the term is commonly used, it refers to views that give quite strong priority to the reduction of suffering.
So what's the distinction between theoretical and practical questions in ethics when it comes to reducing suffering specifically?
Right. So one way to describe this, like in broad terms, is that so the theoretical questions relate to include questions such as what would be best or morally right to do in the ideal case, right? In the ideal kind of thought experiment, what should one do there? And then the practical questions, in contrast, concern what would be best or morally right to do in our non-ideal world. So what would be the best way to reduce suffering given the kinds of constraints that we are facing, and you could say other people or agents who don't necessarily share our views and who aren't necessarily willing to maybe even consider them in the first place. And I think one reason I think this is a very important distinction is that it matters a lot to how we think and how we approach the questions that we're facing and what kind of advocacy we are doing. And one particular way in which it's relevant is that without this distinction in mind, we might be strongly focused on, well, we have a great theoretical argument. So what's the best thing to do is obviously just to go out and make this argument for the kind of moral view that we find to be obviously most reasonable. And I should also say that when it comes to these theoretical questions, I myself tend to be I mean, it's fair to say that I myself can roughly be characterized as a negative utilitarian, and I suspect that's true of at least quite a number of antinatalists. So at that level, I don't necessarily have such strong theoretical agreements with at least those antinatalists who share that view. But when it comes to practical questions, I might have a rather different view, such as, for example, when it comes to whether advocating for antinatalism is among the very best things we can do to reduce suffering, and that's something that I have my doubts about for a variety of reasons. Which isn't to say that there isn't an important place for making those arguments, but another thing I want to stress with respect to this distinction is that, I think a key term here is what's sometimes been referred to as the illusion of control. So this idea that, this phenomenon where we humans, unfortunately, we often have a tendency to overestimate what we can control. That's not to say that we can't also make the opposite mistake of underestimating how much of an impact we can have. I think that's actually also very, very common. But I think the illusion of control becomes very relevant when it comes to, for example, that we might have some kind of idealized scenario, and which could, for example, be voluntary human extinction, and to then maybe overestimate the degree to which we can make that happen if we just work hard enough and do the very best we can, right, towards that end. And and so in general, as a general remark with respect to the practical question of what's best to do in practice, if, for example, we think our overriding or main aim is to reduce suffering, I think it's extremely important when thinking about that practical question to not, to sort of visualize a very broad space of possible actions or priorities that we could be taking there. And I think it's very important not to simply prematurely collapse our focus and our priorities into one tiny narrow space and to say, okay, this is the answer, let's move forward with that. Because I think, this is also what psychologist Daniel Kahneman, he has said that he thinks plausibly the biggest bias for humans when we make decisions is the availability heuristic, which is basically that we tend to go with whatever kind of idea, if we have a decision that we're facing, or it can also be just when we're asked about a certain question where we don't know the answer and have to estimate, we often go with whatever seems most salient or whatever is just available in our working memory, as opposed to taking a step back and looking at a fuller space of possible answers that we could give to the question. And I think this is fairly relevant in the context of antinatalism, where, or rather, like the general question of how we can best reduce suffering and how that relates to antinatalism, where it can sort of be the maybe super salient answer that we can zoom in on, and thereby potentially, and I'm just saying, at least potentially raising as a question, neglecting a wider landscape of priorities or actions or ideas that might also, at the very least, also be worth prioritizing, and which might indeed, if we take into consideration what other people are working on and prioritizing, which might overall actually be more pressing or worth prioritizing, given, for example, how neglected these ideas might be. And I know I'm sort of going into a bit of a monologue here, but there were a few points that I want.
No, go for it.
Yeah, thanks. To make in relation to this, a related point is that, when it comes to the practical questions, unlike in sharp contrast to the theoretical case, where we can just make an argument for a given ethical view. We don't necessarily have to think about the style in which we present it, right? That isn't necessarily so important if we're just discussing purely ideas, but in the practical case, or I mean to say, if we're discussing ideas in some kind of ivory tower, right? But yeah, in the practical case where we are interacting with a wider world, I think it's very important to keep in mind that there is the risk that one can make things worse, unfortunately, right? That there are various backfire risks that we have to be concerned about, and which are, and yeah, that is possible to push people away rather than to draw them toward us, right? And I think this kind of, that this is a possibility can maybe often feel quite remote when you look out at a world that's just absolutely horrific, right? We just saw Oscar give his presentation and showed already just a few images of like just the horrors that are taking place every single day on our planet, right? And it's just completely unspeakable, the suffering that's taking place, right? So that kind of state of things can obviously give us like a strong sense of urgency, right? We have to do something, and it can only get better from here. But then unfortunately, I mean, in one sense it's a very understandable sentiment, but unfortunately it is possible to push people away, to alienate people, right? So, and that highlights the need to be, in fact, this relates to, I guess, the panel that were just before this session, right? The need to be, or at least I think that was an important part of what they were discussing, right? They need to be reasonably inviting, and have, I think Amanda emphasized this, a certain level of kindness, while of course also being honest and being willing to be assertive about the important ideas that one has. I don't think these need to be in conflict, but I do think it's really worth thinking about how one can avoid this. I mean, arguably it's already become like the standard image, at least in some circles, unfortunately, that like antinatalists are just, I mean, it's a bit like vegans, right? I mean, we can be a very stigmatized group, and yeah, I guess that can just have compounding effects when you add many of these ideas, right? And I think it's worth thinking about how one, I mean, some stigma will probably always, or not necessarily always, but it's to be expected. But yeah, I think it's worth thinking about how one can reduce that within the bounds of honest conversation. And yeah, like, and also like another point related to the practical issues is like just the importance of being aware of our biases and the potential for us to be biased, right? I noticed like the panel before me discussed this thing about infighting and how there can be conflicts. And I think in many cases, this kind of stuff can happen because we are, maybe sometimes secretly competitive without us necessarily knowing about it, right? We can have various hidden motives. We can want to elevate our own status, even if we're not so conscious about it. That can be a strong motive, and that can often lead to conflicts, right? That people can compete to be the best do-gooder, the most admired do-gooder. And anyways, but that's just one kind of bias, right? And another is to be overconfident, and I think overconfidence relates very strongly to this broader landscape and this tendency to narrow down on like a specific area or a specific priority. Without necessarily having given a lot of thought to other aspects, right? Overconfidence doesn't always feel like overconfidence. So it doesn't necessarily feel like overconfidence when one says, oh, this rest of the landscape that I haven't explored so much, that doesn't feel so important, it can't be that important to explore. But yeah, and I think, and this is really not pointing fingers at anyone, right? I think this is like of universal importance and value to be aware of our own biases, right? And really to point our fingers at ourselves about this. And then, like, sort of, I think one of the final points, a point that I maybe got a bit inspired to talk about by having watched both the presentation given by David Pierce and also later by Matti yesterday, is that I think both those presentations were, I think, in their own ways, fairly optimistic in some sense, in different ways. But so they are both, you can say, in some sense, well, obviously they both have theoretical and practical elements, and their disagreement is not necessarily so strong at the theoretical level, whereas there's more of a divergence, you could say, in their answer to the practical question, the practical, ethical, moral question. But I think what actually they both have in common, what unites them, is that they are in some sense both examples of like what one might call like a best case focus, or a focus on best case outcomes. In David's case, a focus on eradicating suffering via biotechnology, and in Matti's case, it's the idea of voluntary human extinction, right? Which of course one can agree with at a theoretical level without necessarily being a practical, a main practical focus, right? And I myself would also think that would be a better outcome, voluntary human extinction, right, than any realistic alternative. I mean, of course, there can be some complications there with respect to, for example, wild animals. But if we set that aside for the moment, but the thing I wanted to say about a focus on best case outcomes is that I think it's worth at least considering the question of whether it might actually, or to consider the possibility that the best way to reduce the most suffering and expectation might be by focusing on the prevention of worst case outcomes, rather than focusing on the very best case. And so again, I raise this as something to at least consider, and which I think, in addition, that there are a number of good arguments for it that, for example, have been presented in, so like my colleague Tobias Baumann at the Center for Reducing Suffering, he last year published a book that's called Avoiding the Worst, How to Avoid a Moral Catastrophe. And it's also available for free here on YouTube, where people can listen to it as an audiobook. And so anyways, he there explores both the case for a focus on reducing the risk of worst case outcomes, and also like some of the practical aspects of how we might go about doing this, which of course is like an uncertain question, and it's also early stage in terms of like the research on this issue. And one thing that I think is important to say about this thing about having a focus on worst case outcomes, or at the very least not to exclude that from you could say what's on our radar. One thing to say about it is that admittedly it might not be so appealing or satisfying of a focus, because, for example, we might have this urge to, like, we want to find the solution, we want to simply end suffering, but that we might have such an urge, which of course I very much share very deeply, that doesn't mean that that's necessarily, in practice, that is necessarily the best thing to focus on. That it could be that the better thing might be to, and again, it doesn't have to be mutually exclusive, right? But to at least also have a very a strong focus on the avoidance of worst case outcomes. And what's also important to stress about that, and I think that's probably the final point I want to make in this rather long rant, is that the case for focusing on worst case outcomes, or at least giving great importance to that, is not actually, it doesn't rest on the claim that it's unrealistic to bring about best case scenarios, right? Because, for example, you could think that there's like roughly 1% or even like 5% probability that you could create this kind of best case scenario of doing something whereby humans deliberately phase out suffering or our own existence, for example. But even if there is that probability, that could at the same time also, given that we are in a state of uncertainty, be a like similar probability that of a worst case outcome where of a future where we create far more suffering than even exists on Earth today. And given that this is where the argument maybe becomes a bit more technical, and I'm happy to also share some links that elaborate further on this. But like the point is that the counterfactual impact that one can have on the worst case outcomes and expectation would be so vast, right? So maybe like a rough analogy I might give is something like and again, this is like very rough, but like something like with 80% probability you could prevent someone from having their leg broken, versus with like, say, shall we say, even like a 1% probability you could end factory farming, right? So even though the latter is a very uncertain bet, it still seems overall like the right thing to do, just given how consequential the latter one would be if it succeeds. Or even if you, I mean, of course, in the real world, it wouldn't be so binary as a like either or, but a matter of like with our individual actions, right? We would sort of on the margin change different probabilities, right? And the point there is that from like a more or less sort of quote standard scenario, increasing the probability of like a best case outcome would compared to the worst case outcome, like reducing probability of a worst case outcome would in expectation have far greater expected impact, given that there would be so much more suffering involved. I don't think I really explained that so well, and of course it relates to or rests on this like a general expected value framework, which, just to clarify, and I excuse that this is getting a bit long-winded and technical, but just that an important clarification there is that one doesn't have to be like a pure utilitarian or even a pure consequentialist to think that it makes sense to at least be somewhat guided by these considerations about expected value. But so anyways, that was a long rant, but I think I said some of the main things I wanted to say there.
No, thank you for all of that. And there's a few things I want to touch on, but before we get to certain aspects of that, I want to zoom a bit back out and talk. I've got sort of two questions more about the theoretical side of things. So the first one was, so you were saying suffering focused ethics is sort of, it's a broad umbrella term for ethical frameworks that, really sort of prioritize or put, an emphasis of value on suffering and reducing that. For many people, when we talk about suffering, they understand that to be an experience. Suffering is something we experience as a sentient being, but there are also other sort of forms of harm or other things people see as bad that may not fall into the category of an experience of suffering. So one example of that is anti-frustrationism. And I wanted to ask you if you could just give a brief sort of outline as to what anti-frustrationism is to the people watching, and how something like anti-frustrationism could fit into a suffering-focused ethics framework.
Right. So anti-frustrationism is a view that's was defended back in the 1990s by a German philosopher named Christoph Frege. And what it basically says is that, well, it's a view of value that says that that essentially says that the best outcome we can have is one in which there are no preference frustrations. So in that sense, it's a view from which you can very naturally derive antinatalism. So in some sense, it almost falls directly out of it, at least if you're looking at a single life in isolation. And of course, that is then somewhat different because the view is an ideal preference view. So it's not focused purely on just experiences and experiential well-being, but also takes into account preferences about, things that don't necessarily relate to experiences. If you have a certain preference about how things are out in the world. But of course, that kind of view is not necessarily incompatible with a focus on experiential suffering as well, because you can say that experiencing suffering is arguably also a form of preference frustration, and you could even go further and say that's arguably like the strongest kind of preference frustration is to experience extreme suffering, right? So these kind of experience-based versus preference-based views, they are different in some important ways, but they also have a considerable overlap, you could say.
And the other sort of theoretical question I had before we get on to more sort of practical ones is there's this, I mean, you'll be more plugged into communities that talk about population ethics than I am, but my understanding is that there's a divide in the discussion on population ethics that is sometimes referred to as Narveson's dictum. So it's a divide between whether, if we have a certain amount of energy to do good in the world, should we be putting that into making people happy who already exist, or should we be putting that effort into creating new people who will be happy? Or is there a sort of moral difference between those two things? What's your sort of take on this question? And is there a particular angle that a suffering-focused ethics can come at it from?
Well, yeah, so particular angle. Well, in fact, yeah, I mean, I guess one angle would be that, which is one that I myself endorse, is basically to say that pleasure simply can't, or even other purported goods can't outweigh suffering, especially not extreme suffering, right? So, and from that kind of view of well-being, I mean, you can talk about both experiential well-being and other purported forms of well-being. Yeah, like from that kind of view, it would follow that there's really no moral importance in bringing about happy people, and it's also, it cannot be morally justified to spend resources on that if it comes at the opportunity cost of failing to reduce extreme suffering, right? So that, to my mind, is yeah, I mean, many people frame population ethics as this very difficult, tricky field, whereas in my view, certainly in the theoretical case, it's actually not particularly tricky. Like, it's to simply have, and even there are many views that give this, like, that basically give this kind of asymmetric answer that I would agree with, right? So the theory you mentioned, defended by Frege, about anti-frustrationism would be one example, but there's also just the view that in terms of experiential well-being, that pain and pleasure are not morally symmetric, that you can't treat pleasure as negative pain.
So I wanted to get into more practical things now, and one of them I had lined up anyway, but you actually mentioned it in your answer to my second question, which was when you were referring to the panel that happened just before our session about certain behaviors or norms that would be good to encourage in a community that is seeking to reduce suffering. And I know so leading up to this, I listened to an interview or discussion you did on, I believe it was the Clearer Thinking podcast about reasoned politics. I forget when it was recorded, so it may be from a while ago. But I wanted to ask you what norms, whether they're social or otherwise, you think would be beneficial to establish in the antinatalist community with a view of individuals in that community and groups making more effective decisions in what they focus on in their advocacy.
Yeah, I mean, so obviously this is a very big topic, and there's a lot that one could say about it. I do write a bit about this in chapter 4, I believe, in Recent Politics, although that's like in the context of politics. But if I had to emphasize one or mention one in particular, I would probably say that this is like both a norm socially, but also something to have maybe awareness of in the personal case. But like this key difference between whether one is trying to appear good and like look really good and like someone who's a morally good person versus actually being effective in terms of reducing suffering, right? And this sounds very trivial, but I think it's actually anything but trivial to see these kinds of drives in ourselves, and to create a community that's strongly focused on the effectiveness aspect, right? Because this thing about appearance, it doesn't just work at the individual level, right? There can also be the appearance of wanting to make one's community look good, for example. This kind of concern for, one might frame it in terms of like collective status, and also, I mean, quite related to that. So maybe I allow myself to make like a separate point there, is that so sometimes there can be this strong pressure to do things that sound great to the in-group, right? And which might gain us a lot of status in the in-group. A good example of this, I mean, we can also here talk about, for example, the vegan community, right? You can often see people who might say things that, at least I can think of many examples of this, where you do something that's perhaps a very dramatic act, and it makes you look very good to your in-group, the kind of group that you maybe most want to impress and you most want to have like standing and recognition in their eyes. But there's the question of whether the thing that you're doing necessarily is the thing that you're doing that successfully gains your status in the community is necessarily what actually is most helpful in the bigger perspective, right? Because those two things are not necessarily convergent. And of course, this is where like social incentives can also become helpful, right? Because if you then have a community that is generally very focused on effectiveness, then you can push the individual incentives in that direction, right? You can, if you manage to get to a point where the thing that gains you status or recognition in your community is in fact what is fairly effective in terms of helping out there in the real world, which granted, there's always going to be substantial uncertainty about what that is. But at least to have an eye for that is, I think, very, very helpful.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I think it sort of encourages self-reflection, because I think we actually all fall victim to that in some ways. It's not, you know, maybe there are specific individuals that fall more afoul of that. But, you know, there's the old saying of like, if you point one finger at someone else, you've got, you know, 3, or if you include your thumb, 4 pointing back at you. So yeah, I think that's a good thing to always keep in mind. When it comes to effectiveness and advocacy, if you know, many of the people watching will be antinatalists themselves, and they may feel they may have a sort of the word is escaping me now, but they may be very driven to do a form of advocacy that leads to a reduction in the amount of beings coming into existence, right? That may just be something they very personally resonate with. If that is the case and they want to do advocacy around that, what's your opinion on which group of beings they should focus that on? Because with antinatalist advocacy, we've sort of identified, you've got humans, domesticated animals, wild animals, and then there is the possibility of, future beings who, may potentially exist in the future, such as, a form of digital sentience or artificial sentience, however you want to refer to it. What group do you get the feeling for at the moment is the one that someone like that should prioritize their advocacy towards?
Yeah, I mean, so first of all, I mean, I guess as a general matter, I think it makes a lot of sense not to exclude anyone, right? And to be, mostly it probably makes sense to be fairly general when you can, at least again, if you're making an argument like at the theoretical level, you obviously don't want to make it exclusive there. Then of course you could say in the practical case, might it sometimes be more important to focus on some beings rather than others? And I think that can certainly be the case. At least sometimes. And then of course there can be arguments back and forth about different groups. So one simple factor, and obviously very important one, is to look at both numbers and also to look at quality of life, right? So for example, and both of these parameters or factors would lead you to look at farmed animals are more numerous than humans, although of course there's a complication because it's because of the humans that they exist. Additionally, and perhaps additionally, you have wild animals, which, as Oscar Horta mentioned, are much more numerous than farmed animals, even if you're just counting vertebrates, where fish are extremely numerous. But in addition, I mean, you would have to practically basically ignore invertebrates in order to say that farmed animals, even if you're just focusing on land animals, to say that farmed animals quote dominate in terms of where there's more suffering. So I mean, and I've written an essay that's called I think 10 biases against prioritizing wild animal suffering, where I do think that there is a huge blind spot in the animal movement when it comes to animals in the wild, and I think there are a number of reasons for that. So one is that we often have what some have referred to as a dyadic morality, where there is basically a perpetrator and a victim, and that when there's that thing going on, that really it sort of fires up our moral emotions and our moral cognition. So there we really get exercised about that, and something has to be done, which of course is true. But the flip side of that is that we can then neglect instances of suffering where there is no obvious perpetrator, but for the beings who suffer, it might be just as bad or worse. So I think this is a big bias when it comes to what's happening in nature. Another bias there is also just pure momentum, right? So like when it comes to the animal movement, it's focused so strongly historically on farmed animals. So this idea that one should also focus on wild animals, it might seem a bit far out to many people because they haven't really come across it. So it must be fringe and crazy, right? But anyways, I think there are good reasons to, especially considering in the current animal movement, just how neglected wild animals are. I think there are strong reasons to, or at least it's at the very least worth considering whether that might actually be where one can make the bigger difference if one is to prioritize between them. And a bit relatedly, I think I heard a couple of times that something like antinatalism for wild animals was referred to as an extreme position. And I think maybe in some ways, if you're talking about what's perhaps outside of the public discussion or the so-called Overton window, then I might agree. But actually, if you look at the quality of life, right, of animals in the wild, and you look at just both the birth rates and also how common premature death is, you can actually say, in some sense, there's a sense in which antinatalism for wild animals is like maybe the least extreme antinatalist position you can hold, right? It's a very minimal position that you don't even have to be remotely close to. You don't even have to be suffering focused, I would argue, in order to hold that view. But yeah, of course. So now we touched on these kind of like three broad groups of existing beings, right? And then there's the concern about like the risk of creating artificial beings, right? And I think there are a few qualifications that are worth making, right? Because a lot of people will, like David Pearce, for example, will be very skeptical of at least of the idea of digital sentience in particular. But what I think is very important to stress is that artificial sentience is not need not be digital sentience, right? So you can say, just make a general argument that whatever processes are happening in our brains that are responsible for mediating suffering, it seems plausible that can, at least in principle, be recreated in ways that are not, you could say, biological, or it's not a form of biology as we know it. So I think even if one is perfectly confident that digital sentience is impossible, and I agree with David Pearce that we at the very least have reason to be skeptical of that, I don't think, unfortunately, that means that we can ignore the risk of artificial sentience, especially when we think about the fact that that humans over the last 100 years or so have created this extremely horrific institution of factory farming, right, and modern day slaughterhouses. So what's in fact, I think, very instructive in this regard is to look at, there were a couple of philosophers back in the 1800s who both wrote about this. They both wrote basically that from the point where they were, things could only get better. And it's important to then keep in mind, they wrote that in an age before factory farming even existed, right? They were so sure that things couldn't possibly get worse. But in fact, the first factory farm was still, I guess, several decades away from even opening, right? Even starting, right? So I think there can, unfortunately, be this tendency towards wishful thinking, this tendency, and by the way, these were both great, in some ways, great philosophers. One of them was Louis Gompertz, one of the very first animal rights advocates and vegans. Anyway, so these, in some ways, pretty great minds could nevertheless still make this huge mistake of completely overlooking the fact that things could get much worse, and that in fact humanity could create this new kind of moral catastrophe. I mean, not super new in the sense that it was alien beings or very strange beings that they wouldn't know about, and then again, in some sense, they actually are, right? Because the way in which we bred chickens since then is just bear no resemblance to the kind of chickens who existed around 200 years ago, right? So it's just, as a general matter, important not to overlook the risk that things can get much worse, as unpleasant as that is to think about, and also as, in some sense, unthinkable as it is, right? When you look at the scale of both factory farming and wild animal suffering. But I think it is an instructive lesson to look at how people in the past, unfortunately, have seem to have had a pretty huge blind spot in this regard. And so, for that very reason, I think it teaches us to not make the same mistake, right? At the very least, it gives us some pause to reflect on whether we might be making a similar mistake if we completely dismiss, maybe wishfully, optimistically, dismiss this notion of artificial sentience.
So I had sort of two questions on the effective altruism community, because I know I know you sort of, I don't know if you consider yourself part of the community, but I know you've definitely interacted with the community and members of it, and made contributions. And the first thing that I wanted to ask is, you have written about how you've been disappointed with the reception of or reaction to suffering-focused ethics in effective altruism spaces. I wanted to ask if suffering-focused ethics, or at least more of a priority put towards that way of viewing ethics, was adopted, in a widespread way by the EA community. How do you think, if it would at all, how do you think that would change their priorities and their cause areas?
Yeah, I mean, I think it would change things a lot. And I think there's a lot that one could say about this, but I mean, to just try to be very brief, yeah, they would focus less on preventing extinction, which is a very big focus right now in the EA movement. I mean, yeah, as far as I can tell, it's almost the exclusive focus for a great number of people in that movement. And yeah, and instead they would focus more on preventing both, existing forms of extreme suffering and extreme violence that's taking place right now. And in addition, not least, they would give a lot of attention and priority to the prevention of worst case outcomes, right? To try to avoid, these, as they've been called, S risks, right? So risks of astronomical future suffering, but also just, it doesn't even have to, like maybe that's worth clarifying, that the case for focusing on worst case futures is not even predicated on the on space colonization, although that of course can strengthen the case greatly, but also just on Earth, unfortunately, there is the potential for things to get even worse, even in the absence of space colonization, such as due to like some of the technologies we discovered, like the risks of creating those.
So I know we're kind of coming towards the end, so I've got one more quick question on EA, and then maybe we could sort of move on to the final question. So you've already kind of referenced it, actually. So one of the sort of big topics in the effective altruism space is the idea of long-termism. It's particularly become popularized since the release of Will MacAskill's book, which I think it was released within the past year anyway. Sometimes time passes me by. But are you able to give a quick explanation to the audience as to what long-termism is, and just a brief overview of what your agreements and disagreements with it are?
Yeah, so with respect to long-termism, I think it's worth saying that in some ways it can be maybe a somewhat deceptive term, at least in the way it's come to be used, right? So because there is a very minimal definition of what long-termism is, which basically says that that we shouldn't discount, or at least not heavily discount, the interests of future beings. So if a being is suffering, it doesn't matter whether the being is suffering right now, or 100 years from now, 1,000 years from now, or 1,000,000 years from now. We should still treat that suffering or care equally about that suffering regardless, or at least roughly equally. So that's a very minimal definition of long-termism, and one can have an asymmetric view or a pessimistic view of in population ethics, or with respect to procreation, and then still agree with this minimal version of long-termism. But then, of course, where it gets a bit maybe deceptive is that the minimal version is not how it's typically used, like especially in the EA community, or perhaps the what can I say, like in the long-termist part of effective altruism, it is usually it combines the sort of minimal version of care about beings everywhere with an additional more optimistic view of population ethics that would say that, for example, pleasure can outweigh pain, or other goods can outweigh pain, and it can be worth creating new happy lives, even if there are other miserable lives. So as long as there are enough happy lives, then that can make up for it, if they're sufficiently happy at least. And so that's the kind of view that obviously a lot of people, including myself, take issue with and argue can be potentially even dangerous. In fact, philosopher Karl Popper, he actually already wrote about the dangers of this kind of view, which can, or at least he wrote specifically about utopianism and how wanting this kind of being motivated to create a far future utopia could justify virtually any means, right, including a lot of suffering, which is something that I think, well, unfairly, people often overlook the fact that that's not true of negative utilitarianism, in the sense that it wouldn't justify, any suffering in order to reach some kind of supposedly happy state that outweighs the suffering, which I think is a great strength and a strong point in favor of negative utilitarianism, not having those kinds of like harm increasing trade-offs. But anyway, so that's how long-termism has come to be used. And when you read, for example, in various places, critiques have been made of long-termism, that's usually not this kind of minimal version of long-termism, but rather you could call it the optimistic version of long-termism. That's often been critiqued, and I think rightly so.
So I had one more question, but before I asked it, I wanted to ask you if there were any other topics or points that you wanted to convey to the audience that we maybe haven't touched on in any of my questions.
Right. So I guess one last little sort of tiny thing that occurred to me was that when I talked about a focus on worst case outcomes, or at least including that kind of focus, and maybe even focusing more on that than the best case outcomes. I think perhaps a natural question one could have, it might be that, well, wouldn't advocating for antinatalism also be the best way to prevent worst case outcomes and to reduce risks of those occurring? And I think that's certainly is not unthinkable, that it could be helpful, but I think at the very least, I think there are some reasons to be skeptical. So first of all, you could just say that, again, like there are so many different potential actions and priorities, right, you could take to try to prevent very bad outcomes. And so, in fact, for like any particular one that you might raise as being the optimal one, just given the fact that this is such a big broad space, there's some reason to be skeptical that should happen to be the very best thing. And then additionally, I would say that I think it can maybe also be helpful to sort of frame it in terms of, like, I think it can be a core component of one's approach, right? And especially like defending views that give strong importance to the prevention of suffering, right? One could say that antinatalism can be an example of that, although, in my view, there are probably views that are even more, maybe, I suspect could be more convincing. Like, for example, views that, or also arguments for antinatalism, but also views in general that emphasize extreme suffering, right? So I think sometimes in the context of antinatalism, this can be referred to as, or can at least fall under the risk argument, right? And referred to. And in my view, so my own view is that extreme suffering in particular is of overriding importance. So even if one is focusing on moral arguments, I might suggest that this kind of focus on extreme suffering might be overall more effective, maybe both theoretically and practically sound. But then in addition, you could also say that moral arguments in themselves. And while I've also emphasized that as, you could say, something that I see as important to focus on and something I believe is helpful and valuable to do, I don't think it's exhaustive or sufficient in itself. I think it's important to also look at like concrete practical questions, right? And frankly, there are a lot of them, right? So a specific class of issues that's highly relevant is like the issue of politics and what kind of policies to institute. And that's where I think people who are trying to reduce suffering, there's potentially a lot to gain, right? Especially because a lot of people do actually do think that it's important to reduce future suffering. I've also written a post about that if you just simply look at what lay people's views are in population ethics, they're actually, it seems overall, like, of course, this argument, it doesn't involve some extrapolation, but it does seem like generally people seem to think that it's much, much more important to avoid outcomes with a lot of suffering than to create a very large utopia, right? As is the focus of many people in the effective altruism movement. So there is at least potentially, there are some reasons to think that you could actually maybe tap into a large consensus there and gain support for policies that perhaps make humanity more resilient to, like, such that we can avoid worst case outcomes, right? To specifically make us make those less likely, which I suspect also that's another thing, that's another potential like practical reason in favor of focusing on the avoidance of worst case outcomes, is that it would actually, there's the strange situation where it's at the same time very neglected, but it seems like potentially you could actually gain a lot of support for it if you manage to sort of tap into this reservoir of dormant support.
So we're coming to the end of time. So I've got one last question, which if you can give a brief answer on. So I very quickly wanted to ask, the people watching will presumably be a group of people who are, who want to reduce suffering in the world, who care about making the world a better place. What can they do as individuals to propagate suffering-focused ethics?
Yeah, that's a great question. So one slightly, maybe disappointingly boring answer is that I think it's very helpful to read about these issues, and to read about them from like a variety of authors. So I think, in fact, it can be helpful to become familiar with in fact, I think I would encourage reading both like on the theoretical level and the practical level, because both can matter, and like the kind of which view one adopts at the theoretical level can ultimately matter a lot for what you do in practice, right? So, for example, if you do think that extreme suffering is the overriding priority, that can come to matter, at least in some respects, it can come to matter a lot when it comes to what you try to do in practice. So yeah, I mean, of course, it's probably extremely self-serving that I say that as someone who writes books about these issues, but to be honest, most of the writing that's out there is not by me, obviously. So, and of course, there can also be important differences, right, in terms of whether one is aiming to specialize, trying to advance or further advance suffering-focused ethics with like original work, or whether one is trying to do advocacy. I mean, I think it's helpful to be highly informed in both cases. But of course, if one is primarily focusing on the more practical side, then I would say still, in fact, reading up on some of the stuff that's been written about the practical issues can, I think, be helpful. And as I think I mentioned earlier, my colleague's book avoiding the worst, how to prevent a moral catastrophe. I think that's a pretty good place to start as an introduction, also on the practical issues.
Cool. Well, we're sending out a newsletter after this, probably tomorrow morning, tomorrow morning for me anyway. So I'll include a link to that directly, the YouTube audio version. But yeah, thank you so much for joining, Magnus. And to round off, the last session of the first conference. So thank you so much for joining us and answering all the questions.
Yeah, thanks a lot for having me. It was I enjoyed joining you.
Great. Thanks so much. Okay, and we're back. Can you hear me?
Well, me?
Yeah.
Or anyone else? Yeah, I can hear you nice and clearly.
Okay, great. Okay.
You found out where the mute button is now.
Well, what I've done is I've just gotten to the point where I just don't touch it now. I'm like, I don't even want to put myself on mute because I know what will happen. Yeah. What did we start the closing remarks with yesterday? I guess just
a recap for the day.
Yeah,
really,
yeah.
I mean, well, the conference.
Thank you to everyone for joining, especially those who watched all of it both days. I know who some of you are. And yeah, just one thing so we don't forget it, subscribe to the newsletter so that you don't miss. One important thing will be is that the newsletter going out tomorrow will have a roundup of everything that's happened today with the links that all the speakers have wanted us to share, but also the feedback form. So if you want to help us make the next conference even better than this one, then definitely be on the newsletter, get the newsletter, and fill in the feedback form. We'd really appreciate hearing your thoughts. But yeah, John, did you have anything else you wanted to say before we give sort of our recaps of the day?
Yeah, just a huge thank you to everyone who's tuned in. Thank you to all of our speakers, the moderators, everyone who's made this possible, really. And yeah, please do subscribe to the newsletter so you can get, as Laura was saying, a roundup of everything, and also let us know how we did and what we can improve on for future iterations. I think we have decided that we will do future iterations. If this was a complete nightmare, then maybe we might not have done. But definitely looking forward to future AACs.
We've been able to boomer our way through it somehow.
just about.
But anyway, so shall I kick off with Oscar Horta? So yeah, I like really enjoyed Oscar's. I mean, somewhat depressing subject, but it's good to hear that what he was all the things he presented actually made me realize that the use of contraception in wild animals is actually more established than I thought it was, and this is, it's like something I'm interested in. Whenever I see articles about it, I dip in. Yeah, like some of the papers, and there was even a conference on it. which I wasn't aware of. So yeah, I really enjoyed his presentation. And I also appreciated the fact that he brought up panspermia as well, because, you know, even though for a lot of people, like he said, you know, it comes across as a bit sci-fi and stuff like that, but I do genuinely think we're getting to the point where that is actually a serious consideration. You know, what with SpaceX, you know, their rocket launchers getting, you know, more successful, the plans to have a permanent base on the moon, to send people to Mars. So, you know, these things are, you know, they sound sci-fi, but they are serious considerations now. So
definitely. And yeah, Oscar Horta was the person who opened my eyes to wild animal suffering. I used to actually enjoy watching all of the nature documentaries before reading Oscar Horta, so he ruined those for me. But again, it massively opened my eyes to this problem that I've been very ignorant of. So it was amazing to hear him speak, for sure.
What did you think? How was the panel?
I think it was great. I think, in hindsight, criminally short. We could have heard from all
Yeah,
three guests.
I agree. Yeah.
So sorry about that, but yeah, just really, really insightful. Everything rooted practically as well. I'm definitely planning on doing some sort of write-up from the panel with a list of suggestions on the topics and thinking of ways to implement them, because, yeah, really insightful stuff. I think building a healthy antinatalist community it's not going to be easy, but it's not easy for any communities either. I don't think, and I generally don't believe, that the antinatalist community is particularly further away than other communities I've been involved in or I've come across. And yeah, I will, as a starting point, as I said, I will try and embody more the kind of just positive and happy and just kind person, which I think can go a really long way. So huge thank you to all three of the panelists, Amanda, Ash and Shweta. Really, really grateful. And yeah, looking forward to trying to implement some of this has definitely guided our strategy on this going forward. As one of our aims is obviously building the antinatalist community in a positive way.
Yeah, and I 100% agree on the fact that the panel should have been longer. I mean, that was as the person who put together the schedule, that was my bad. But, you know, I'm sure a bunch of people are going to put that in the feedback form. So next time we will likely have a panel. And if we do, it will definitely be longer than 55 minutes.
I'm sure.
Yeah, and then Magnus's, my conversation with Magnus, again, I really enjoyed it, and I think the biggest thing I took away is that there is often a really big difference. So if you have a specific way that you want to make the world a better place, there's a really, you know, often quite big divide between the theory and the practical, and you really have to think about, what are my theoretical sort of ideals that I want to aspire to and achieve, and are the sort of intuitive practical steps I can take coming to my mind actually the most effective way of doing that? Like, we really have to think about, how should I spend my time? Are there going to be things that will come up in the future, or that I can cause, that will be unforeseen? You know, like he gave the example of, you know, the philosophers in the 1800s being quite optimistic about the future concerning animals, having no idea that factory farming was around the corner, which, you know, just made it so much worse. And yeah, these are all like the practical considerations, and recognizing uncertainty as well. Yeah, when he was talking about all that, that really sort of hit that home to me. Yeah.
Definitely. And one thing I've always really appreciated about Magnus Finney's writing is that it is, like, he does talk a lot about practical application and strategy. It's not just a case of putting an idea out there and not thinking about its implementation. It is always very grounded. So yeah, it was great to hear some more of that, basically.
So I'm just thinking, like, next steps that we want to sort of, you know, make people aware of. So I'm just going to say it one more time, even if we've said it multiple times already. Newsletter, feedback form. It would be amazing if we could get as much feedback as possible. Be as harsh as you would like. You know, obviously, you know, don't abusive, but like all constructive. But like, if you want to be critical, please be critical, but obviously in a constructive way. Yeah. But also,
and also links to everybody's work as well, like Henry
Yeah.
Follow-up and all the amazing work of our speakers.
Yeah. But and also let us know what you particularly enjoyed as well. Like, you know, we want the critical stuff, we also want the good stuff as well, because if there was something people really enjoyed, but they didn't actually tell us about it, that may not come up. So we also need to know what people really liked about the conference and found valuable. The only other thing I want to quickly get in is the post day 2 hangout. If you'd like to join the hangout after the stream finishes, please click the link in the description to Discord, and we'll be hanging out there. You know, probably around sort of like 10-ish minutes after us finishing the stream. But yeah, John, did you have anything else to say apart from just like a big thank you to everyone?
Yeah, a big thank you to everyone. Yeah, and obviously a huge thank you to you, Lawrence, who has taken on the majority of the organising.
Oh, no, not at all.
So yeah, again, thank you so much. In terms of, maybe we could talk a bit about like long-term follow-up, like what we plan to do with the content. So we will be releasing the content on YouTube. We are looking to subtitle it, obviously in English, but in other languages as well. So that will take a little while to like transcribe and make sure that we do get the subtitles there. We'll be using these to guide our strategy, as I was saying, in terms of our work going forward. We have plenty of plans in the pipeline for antinatalist advocacy, and certainly ways which involve a lot more interaction with you guys. So please do subscribe to the newsletter and keep up to date, because there will be opportunities for you to get involved. Being a little bit coy about them, because as you can imagine, all of our focus for the past few months has been on this weekend. But yeah, plenty of plans in the pipeline.
Yeah, and actually just on the point of subtitles in other languages, so obviously we'll be releasing these, and obviously they're in English, but we do want people who either don't speak English, or you know, they don't understand English as well as they do their sort of native language or another language. We want to be able to make the content available to them. So if anyone is, you know, willing or experienced in translation and subtitling YouTube videos, please get in contact with us via email or via the form on our website. But we will also be, you know, seeing if we can sort of attract people. But if anyone knows that they would like to, you know, get involved in something like that, then reach out to us, because that would be really useful.
Please do, and we will translate, or we'll transcribe into English first, which will make it quite a bit easier. We need to start afresh.
Yeah, exactly. Luckily, AI is sort of on our side with this one, because you can do the bulk of it can just go into an artificial intelligence, and you can just sort of tweak it as a, you know, a native speaker.
AI might cause S risks, as Magnus Vindig was just talking about, but it will help us transcribe the conference.
Yeah. But yeah, last thing I wanted to say is just thank you so much for people coming. You know, we had pretty consistent viewership throughout the whole 2 days. And yeah, it makes it worth it, you know, because we get speakers on because we think their ideas and their contribution is important. And for people then to be able to see that and be willing to engage with it is you know, really heartening.
Definitely.
Cool. Okay. All right. Well, thank you, everyone. And if you're coming to the Hangout, we will see you at the Hangout. If we don't, then we will see you in 2 years.
All right. Thanks, everyone.